the word science being pimped out. On one hand, I agree. I do think there are some people out there that are using it way too much or expressing things with very little caution. A new study comes out, and there is that sort of snowball effect where a lot of people are talking about it. Some with the appropriate level of terms and conditions and nuance. Some others are just taking it and rolling with it.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education.
This is kind of an interesting place for me to kind of restart or revive our little podcast thing here, considering I think you guys may have been you and Milo were the last people we had on.
Really?
Yeah. And then I had a couple cancellations happen, and then there was the meme thing. And I was just like, all right, I just kind of have lost the motivation to do these things right now. And here we are like 6 months later, and we're doing it again. And the topic, oddly enough, is not very different. It's almost back around. So why don't we start with just like a quick recap of the current dialogue around the science situation, science versus, if you want to give like the most up-to-date summary.
Yeah. So obviously, this is not my stance, or it's just like how I perceive the quote unquote situation to be. There is this idea that it's science versus practice, and we have these sort of biased researchers coming up with all sorts of crazy results that don't hold ecological validity, and all sorts of like minor details that don't really matter and are overcomplicating things. And we're relying on sort of trash data versus the experience of coaches, athletes, and we're talking about high level coaches and athletes and quality anecdote, to put it that way, because there's anecdote and then there's anecdote. So there's this sort of discussion in the community discussion. There's this sort of idea that it's science versus practice, but in both cases, we're looking at caricatures of both science and practice, and it just seems like a never ending sort of situation, which I don't understand where it stems from, because all the people I speak to and respect and are great educators, there's not many people, if any, that will say, yep, science is the only way and we should completely disregard anecdote, or vice versa. So I just think that there's people have this natural inclination to want to go against the big, like they want to find a big guy to go against. In this case, for some people, it's science. For some others, it's the successful coaches or practice.
And I would say in this day and age, a lot of it is just the content creation. So I think right now, what I see is more of an issue is the way that certain terms are used and leverage, right? So like the weaponization of science or the marketing of science. I feel basically, if you think of circa 10 years ago, YouTube, the way a lot of content that was very, we'll say, promotion based was leveraged. You take whatever, the picture of the girl's butt or the abs or whatever it was, and the thumbnail, and then you'd watch a video and they would have nothing to do with that, right? Or okay, cool, it's somebody that has a nice physique, but clearly doesn't really understand what they're talking about or whatever. They're just promoting something. I feel like science has now fallen into, or at least the word science has just become another one of those things to throw on, oh, here's a science-based this or whatnot. I feel like the word is losing meaning. And I feel like there's a dichotomy between those people that will say are more ideologically attached to science and they have an idealism around it. And so they may be frustrated in that, okay, this doesn't actually represent the science. And then you may have other people that look at this and be like, oh, if this is science, then science is a joke because this is not good information, or this is clearly just being used to promote somebody's opinion or agenda. That's where I see the root of the problem, is trying to idealize science on one side and then trying to take the same content and look at it. And basically it's okay, this is the word science being butchered And
Mhm.
because people are basically living in those dichotomies, there's a huge gap between what they think when they see the word science.
Yeah. But do you think that so actually, before asking, I think that it's mostly people having a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, or that they legit don't like that some nerdier or less sort of in the trenches or hardcore people are out there putting out information. Because even if, let's say, we take some of the videos or the content out there that uses science, and don't get me wrong, there are people misusing the word or using it to pimp out their content. But even if you take something as vanilla and as mainstream as like Jeremy Ethier, which is like as gen pop as it gets content wise, right? And his brand is built with science. If you look at his latest video called, what is it? If you want to get jacked in 2024, do this, which is all science based and stuff. You get seven different experts, a lot of detail, some nuance as well. And in the end, you end up with some practical takeaways that are relatively simple and straightforward. There's not inherently a lot of mumbo jumbo. Where I'm going with this is that I don't like when I hear people complain about the word science being pimped out. On one hand, I agree. I do think there are some people out there that are using it way too much, or expressing things with very little caution. A new study comes out, and there is that sort of snowball effect where a lot of people are talking about it, some with the appropriate level of terms and conditions and nuance. Some others are just taking it and rolling with it. And then mainstream media does that too. Certain websites will do that. I saw that with our study that got published lately, and it completely butchered the study and they just put it out there. But overall, I do feel that there is a bit of a knee jerk reaction that it makes things seem worse than they truly are. If we look at the big science based, not even in quotation marks, at the big science based non researcher sort of non researcher communicators, aka people that are not actually researchers but are doing science based content, do you think that there is like I haven't seen anything that would ring a ton of alarm bells. Sure, there's a lot of content, and the word science is there quite a bit, but I'm not sure that it's causing as many issues as people make it out to be. I think it's mostly the perception of hype and the fact that they see science so much more than they used to. Does that make sense?
I don't know that I would agree or have the same anecdote that you do in terms
Mhm.
of the amount of content using the word science that's good or bad. But partly, I think the help would be like, I mean, we don't have it. There's no standard of if you're going to say something is science based, what expectation would I have then viewing that piece of content, right? Who knows? We
Sure.
could be using two completely different scales in terms of what our standard is on when we're going there. What may be interesting to bring up is I just asked my audience, I'm like, hey, when you see science based, what do you think? And I intentionally tagged a bunch of people that are more pro science in that one, so they would see it, but also to maybe see if they would chime in and give some sort of this is what you should expect it, but mostly crickets on that end. But it was a more cynical response than I anticipated. I anticipated it to somewhat lean towards the like, yeah, I'm seeing all these science based this and that. And I know a lot of that's going to be dependent on who you follow. Like everybody's algorithm is unique to them and the content that they consume, right? So you and I could both sit here and talk about the experiences of what we see on YouTube or Instagram. And we could be speaking as if we live in two completely different worlds because our
Exactly.
content is curated to us. And that's why I try not to take just what I see, but I
Mhm.
do feel like my audience is mostly coaches and fitness professionals, right? Like I don't have a lot of like newbie people, like I do some, but a large percentage of people that follow us are there for nuances because we're not posting like the experts check, it's usually more nuanced, especially if you're following my account directly. Right? So I thought maybe, so for me, that at least is helpful in that I know, okay, the people that I'm speaking to, what is their current perception? And I think that the students that come to our seminars that are the most engrossed in our content really appreciate science because they see how we apply it, right? And they see how we're doing our own research to improve our own curriculum. So they're not anti-science by any means. But in terms of the general content that people are consuming, there definitely seems to be a shift towards a negative connotation towards seeing those words that say science based. And I think this was happening with evidence based starting a couple years ago. This is like people, like everybody was using evidence based as just like an ego trip. I think this is, oh, I'm evidence based. And I think there was a little bit of a pushback on that. And now I feel like science based has kind of replaced evidence based in terms of how it's being used in content creation. And I think that there's egos on both sides. But let me ask you this okay, as somebody from the side of academia, what is a realistic standard or expectation of the level of content? What things should I expect from something that's labeled as science based, if it truly is science based? And maybe where is it crossing the line of maybe this is now, all right, we're using these terms and we're not really living up to them?
Yeah. So, in my personal opinion, I would expect a relatively solid amount of scientific evidence behind whatever topic is being explored and the discussion of said evidence to a certain extent, or at least the reference of that evidence. Now, depending on the target audience, the detail that you may go into may vary. So, obviously, if you are somebody who is communicating science to other scientists, you may dive into the stats and dive into, open a few brackets and go into other topics that may be somewhat related to the main topic that you're covering. If you're covering science for the layman, when I see science based, I expect some discussion of the literature, some nuance presented, but obviously not a whole lot of details. So when I hear science based, I know I expect to hear some discussion of the totality of available scientific evidence, along with some nuance, regardless of whether you're talking to the layperson or not. However, I also understand that in order to, like, we're educators, we need to meet the individual where they at in order to take them where we want them to go. So it's I understand that there will be some form of clickbait to an extent, right? I'm not saying 52 sets is the best way to grow muscle, sort of clickbait. I mean, even that you could make it work as long as you start your video and say it's click. I appreciate playing the game because you have to play the game in today's landscape in order for your content to actually be viewed by people. If you named your video dog systematic review, an umbrella review of systematic reviews on all cause mortality and blah 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 blah, an in-depth discussion, and then your thumbnail is just a scientific paper, it's likely that you're not going to reach even the audience that you may be trying to reach. So I understand playing the game to a certain extent, but when I hear science based, I do expect some discussion of the scientific evidence and an appropriate take on the scientific evidence. So, because you could discuss evidence and completely butcher it. But just just to take it back to what you said, I do think that our respective echo chambers affect our perception quite a bit, right? And I think that a lot of people in your world, and to an extent in, because I'm in a few worlds. My main world is the sort of evidence based world, but I do think that people are forming opinions not based on what they've seen, but based on what they've heard from other people and the image that has been painted in regards to, oh, the science people. You get me?
One of the questions I always go back and forth with is what is science and what is not? Because it seems like the there seems to be like science just means the applied research, right? And there's a lot more to science than just longitudinal studies on hypertrophy or whatever it may be, right?
Hmm.
Because we have the foundational level sciences that we use, everything from physics to anatomy and biomechanics. And these are still sciences. So do I need a longitudinal study to say that elbow flexion works the muscles that are across the elbow to, or have an internal moment to do elbow flexion? I think that can be one thing that's kind of tough is like, all right, if we say science based means only things that we're referencing, are
Mhm.
we discounting the foundational sciences like that? Are we putting that stuff on a pedestal and removing some of the stuff that in reality may actually be much more practical, especially for the majority of people consuming some of this content, right? Because when it comes to translating this stuff to the gym, a lot of people, in terms of just getting understanding exercise, learning the foundations, understanding anatomy, a little bit of physics and a little bit of biomechanics is going to go a lot longer, or it's going to help their training a lot more than breaking down the most recent meta-analysis on training to failure, so to speak, right? Not that I'm not saying one's more important than the other, but I feel like there seems to be like this. Okay, science is only this stuff now that we see in research, and all the stuff that's well established. It's once it's been established long enough, it no longer gets the science label anymore.
Yeah.
And if anything, I'm like, actually, those are probably the sciences, like the foundational sciences, is where I tell people that's where you need to start. Like, especially if you're going to properly interpret anything at the higher level, understanding these foundations is probably extremely important because then when you look at a study, you can also take into account some of the things of, oh, all right, if they're talking about two different exercises, you understand some of the elements that make those exercises different. So you can look at it more principally than just A did better than B. And I don't know what to do with that information other than just do A and don't do B. Because in reality, that's not, if we look at a study that compares two exercises, and the only thing that we can take away from that is that one performed the better, and we can take away nothing principally, that's has very little utility. If we can't principally say, okay, what seems to be working is that longer lengths seem to be better. It's not just that, oh, just this one extra. It's not just, if we take, for instance, oh, preacher curls are just better than incline curls because that's how it was done in research. So I'm just only going to do preacher curls instead of understanding, okay, what is it about the preacher curl when we also take into account the rest of the body of evidence? What can we take away from that principally? So I can apply that to my entire exercise library and decision-making process rather than the only thing I can take away from this is just do preacher curls. Cause right now that was the best bicep exercise in longitudinal research right now. Cause we only compared those two things. And well, what about all the other variations of the preacher curl that I could do?
Mhm.
What about single arm and neutral grip and yada, 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 et cetera. So I feel like a lot of the stuff that leads us to the principles is being pushed to the wayside and everybody's just focusing on the newest published longitudinal data. And so many people are skipping the things that would help them understand and also appreciate what knowledge we have accumulated so far. I think a lot of
Mm.
people that are new are jumping in, and the first thing that they're being exposed to is who knows? But likely it's not you guys. Likely it's somebody with 10 times the followers of you guys that maybe has a very absolute view and throw some some PubMed IDs up there or whatnot. And they have no ability to discern whether or not this is good or not. But if the only standard is they cited some research, therefore it must be evidence based, that's a problem. Kind of rambling around it a little bit here. But I think that what I would like to see is that science based is a lot more, we'll say, thorough from foundation up. And I think that's what a lot of the content needs is, okay, it needs to not just be like, hey, here's the results of the studies, but you need to go back and fill in a little bit of that foundational information so that the layperson, some of the logic behind it. I mean, I know a lot of these things, we don't understand the details of these mechanisms thoroughly. We don't know exactly why lengthened bias training is better. We don't know the exact mechanisms. Those aren't fleshed out yet, but we can take okay, here's some examples of exercises that are applying similar principles, and here's some that aren't, and whatever, and things like that. And understanding how you can learn that about exercises, how you can learn, okay, how would I know if an exercise is lengthened bias? I get that. Like even in my comments, somebody asked about how do I know an exercise is like the bias? Or how do I know something has a length bias resistance profile? I'll even get like, how do I know it's at a long muscle length, right? And then to me, that's a sign that, okay, people are skipping to looking at, they're looking at longitudinal studies before even understanding basic anatomy. And so then it's, I can only imagine how tough it is to navigate that space with none of that foundational knowledge and none of those foundational principles. So I'm off track here, but I think that science based right now, I think the way people see that content is skewed because of a lack of the actual foundational sciences to discern the good content from the bad content, and also to make utility of the good content and not look at it through an absolute lens of, okay, this evidence is being presented and that just means I have to do what they did in the study, versus actually what you can take away from this is some principle based information that you can use to help make decisions in training.
Yeah, I hear all that. The, so let me try to address it. Let me try to address things one by one. So the reality of things is that from your standpoint, or at least that's how I view it, you're used to having a lot of people around you that are very analytical. They want to learn more about the body, how it works, how it moves, and so on and so forth. So that curiosity may be perceived as something that everybody has, but because we are in an applied field and people a lot of people that consume our content, they just want to know, okay, I don't really care about how we're getting there or why that's happening. What does the evidence have to say in terms of what works and what doesn't? Obviously, that's expressed in an extremely absolute way. But for example, length and partials, people are seeing that, okay, there's something to that. We don't know the mechanism, but I suspect that a lot of lifters that consume our content, and a lot, I mean the majority, obviously there's going to be pockets of people that care about the mechanisms and the why, and they want to know more about how different muscles function, and is that true for all muscles? But what they care about is, okay, what has the science showed? What has the complicated stuff that we don't want to dive into? What has that showed? Oh, it showed that in practice I need to do this with my bicep curl. Cool. That's all I care about. It's the same with me and cars. I like the car to go fast. I press the gas, it goes fast. I don't care how it does it. If that makes sense. Somebody who's a petrol head may be like, I don't know, I don't know. The analogy was a shitty analogy. We'll delete the analogy with a car, but back to our world. And I do feel that essentially what you're trying to say is that people should be more scientifically literate or more knowledgeable in general in order to be able to properly process all that information that is out there, which I don't disagree with in the sense that if they want to do that, they do need to do more reading and they do need to understand basics and they need to take 5 steps back in order to start reading papers and so on and so forth. But then, wouldn't you say that if a science communicator does a good enough job at laying out some of the basics and saying, okay, if you're doing a video on training a specific muscle, if they give a few basic points in regards to anatomy and the function of that muscle, and then they go into the research, they put out the caveats and they say, look, this is something you can try because we have more evidence showing that it may be beneficial. Is that not enough, or do you think there would need to be even more sort of details and more background reading from the layperson that doesn't care about the details that much in order to actually take something away from it?
I mean, I think obviously it's going to come down to the individual piece of content and what the end message is in terms of what the supportive thing. But I'm not saying that every piece of content needs to have a ton of foundational information, but I think that likely if the focus is only on just looking at the results of the latest longitudinal study, and these same people that are putting out the science based information are not also talking about some of these foundational things, I think you're setting that audience up to have a harder time with that content. Right. So I'm speaking more in general, and that I think that making some of the foundational stuff, quote unquote, sexy again, like taking the same amount of effort to bring that information to the front is probably useful. As well as, yeah, cool. You can have the little bits, whatever supportive stuff that you need to have in there. And I mean, on the days of content creation, I mean, you could never have too much content these days, it seems, right? There's always more. And to be honest, it seems like simple does better, right? I mean, there's two ways to get content that really gets a lot of traction. And one is to make it like ridiculously simple. And then the other one is to have it have some sort of like really sexy clickbaity title or whatever. That's my experience with playing around with content, right? Like some of the stuff that is to me, I would just be like, oh, this is like simple to the point that it's boring and uninteresting, ends up being the most successful stuff, right? And then the most like nuanced and detailed stuff doesn't do well, but then you throw, a clickbaity caption, title, image, or whatever, and all of a sudden then you get that, right? So it's okay finding that balance. And I think that, what's missing is because people are skipping ahead, is they're not being pushed. So if it's not necessarily that every post needs to include all the foundational information, but maybe there needs to be the message of, to get more out of this content, here's some other videos or here's some other resources because you should understand anatomy or you should understand these base foundational sciences. I don't see a push from from the academic community for people to learn more about the foundational sciences. I mean, it's just an observation. I don't really see that. And there's plenty of free resources, right? You don't have to learn anatomy from us. You can learn anatomy free on KenHub. Now, obviously, it's different learning it on pictures versus learning it in 3 dimensions in the context of exercise and stuff. But there's plenty of places to get a very basic understanding of some of these things. Let me lead this into this portion of the question. Then is that okay? You're a sports scientist or exercise science.
Scientist.
It seems like sports science and exercise science seem to be used pretty interchangeably. Is there a
Yeah, yeah.
significant difference at all?
It it depends. Maybe I think on the where you are located. Like it's the same as the word professor. I think in some cases, like in the UK, you have most degrees, if I'm not mistaken, are called sports science, but you could make the argument that sports science is more could in some degrees be related more specifically to sport performance and have more S&C modules and stuff. But there are um in the UK, some degrees are also called sport and exercise science. So yeah, they're used interchangeably. All this to tell you, yes.
So the other thing that we were talking about is the research or whatever data is being presented should be presented with some degree of accuracy and also thorough enough. Because I think a lot of times that just one element is being focused on. And that's where some of the stuff can be misleading, is that it's not taking the totality of evidence. Everybody likes to just talk about, hey, here's the results of this one new thing, and then just doesn't address where that fits in the picture of the totality of the evidence. There's a huge recency bias just in everything, right? If I put out an exercise that is novel and new, it's significantly more popular just because it's novel and new, right? Same thing. Anytime a study comes out, just because it's the newest study, I think there's a recency bias of everybody. This must just be the best evidence that we have on the topic because it's the most recent one, which isn't always the case. Like the newest study, like on average, I think the newer studies are better than the older studies, right? But sometimes the newer studies aren't looking at the question the same way or
Hmm.
whatnot, right? Or they are just, because things are generally underpowered and we're dealing with small sample sizes, they are still, even though it's new and maybe it's better run, it's still just a small amount of data contributing to the whole lot. We can't dismiss all of the data we have just because we get a few more data points from a slightly better run study. It doesn't mean we can discount all of the other stuff because the sample sizes and stuff are just sometimes too small. So I think that is something where sometimes something will be presented and then there's a lot of dissenting opinions within academics as well. And one of the questions that I have for you is what, I guess, how do I put this nicely, right? If somebody's got a PhD, if they are a doctor of sports
A
science,
real
exercise
doctor.
science, et cetera, a real doctor, what is the expectation in terms of knowledge or the understanding of we'll say like the foundational science. So what wouldn't be my expectations from you in terms of talking about physics or biomechanics or anatomy? Like, as somebody with an exercise science, sports science degree, are those fields that you have a robust education and understanding in?
It depends on where you carry out that PhD. In the UK, no. I mean, you can assume some basic knowledge, but at the same time, your PhD will be mostly focused on the one area that you're studying. Now, if that area happens to require you to look into those specific areas that you mentioned, sure. But I personally, when I see PhD, the one thing that it gives me some confidence in, and keep in mind, as we've said multiple times, you should be questioning everyone, regardless of whether they have a PhD, an MD, or the equivalent qualification in terms of anecdote. They may be an IFBB pro or whatever. The only thing that it gives me confidence in is that person has had an extensive amount of experience in terms of dealing with research, interpreting research, and being able to read between the lines and understand their limitations, what they know, what they don't know, um, and so on and so forth. So if I see that, oh, I'm speaking with Coach Kassem, PhD, I feel a bit more confident, at least that's how I go into it, and it may not be true, but I feel a bit more confident that we can talk about scientific evidence and the totality of evidence, the uncertainty around evidence, all the potential co-founders, the lack of evidence in certain areas, and so on and so forth. So that's what it tells me. It doesn't tell me that, oh, Coach Kassem, PhD, has a PhD in sports science. His PhD happened to be in Wingate power testing in recreational Korean barbecue enthusiasts. Therefore, he will know everything that there needs to be known about strength training, about hypertrophy, and so on and so forth. But it does tell me that, hey, he's probably somebody who spent a ton of time doing research. So we can talk about research. And if there's something that we disagree on, we will be able to look at the data together and come to similar conclusions, which unfortunately is not the case, as you see, not just outside of science, but inside science. There's debates in science on like even things that we regard as common knowledge, like the insulin model for obesity. There are papers out there that argue for it, and other papers that argue against it. Obviously, it's up to people that have the appropriate qualifications to then look at all that and essentially say who's right and who's not. But and that in quotation marks. What I wanted to touch on before though is that it's just to take it a couple of steps back. I personally don't think that the average, like the average person who just wants to gain muscle, strength, improve their body composition, I don't think they necessarily need to know anything besides some easy to implement practical takeaways. The details and the information, the extra information and the why behind everything, I think that's more relevant to coaches or strength and hypertrophy geeks and advanced trainees that may want to learn more for the sake of learning more and potentially having that extra knowledge potentially make a difference in their training. But for the average person who just wants to get jacked, I wouldn't put it as a requirement for them to know much more besides, hey, find some credible source of information. And even if those source of information are slightly wrong, it's unlikely that you're missing out on a whole lot. Sorry to black pill the conversation and making
Yeah.
myself redundant here with that statement, but I think it's the reality of things.
Okay, I think that's a good segue into talking about the technique paper that you recently published, which let's just start with if you want to give us a summary of that. But also, my question will be like, so it's a narrative review. If you could
Yeah,
just explain what a narrative review is
for
versus
sure.
a meta analysis or a traditional study.
Yep. A narrative review is essentially our take on the literature. It's an evidence based essay, if you may. So it is not a review that stands very high on the hierarchy of evidence. If we look at the hierarchy of evidence at the top, we have systematic reviews and meta analyses. Then we have randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional studies, case reports, mechanistic studies, and then at the end we have editorial and expert opinion. Now, a narrative review usually sits towards the lower, not usually, most of the time, at the end of that pyramid, because it is essentially our take, the author's take on the literature. Here's some evidence that we've selected because there's no systematic search being done. So you can't really replicate the same search and see if you find the same results as you would with a systematic review. And it is essentially us going over the literature and telling you, hey, this is what we've observed in the literature. Here's that literature, and we're discussing it. Take that and whatever. I mean, in our case, it was exercise technique. Now,
Yeah. So
somebody may
just
ask, oh,
just to put it in
go
the simplest terms, it's the opinion of the authors, right?
yes,
It's, yeah, right now
100%.
it's it's an opinion informed on whatever research is being cited in the review, but it's still just the opinion of the authors. Okay, cool. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, 100%. And that's something that I try to put out there as much as I can. Like the purpose of this paper was just for people, for transparency's sake. Jeff Nippard was interested in doing a technique study. We talked about it. We talked about the potential steps that would require an actual intervention study. And I said that we need to first have a look at the literature to lay a base for a technique study, for an actual intervention study to take place. And because technique is such an understudied area, like the concept of technique specifically is so understudied that even like an official definition was not like we couldn't find a definition for what exercise technique means. We had to suggest our own. And the purpose of this paper, aside from providing some very general practical recommendations with a bunch of asterisks next to them as far as, hey, more research is needed, it was also to lay the base for future research. But in reality, like we're still at the very beginning of research on exercise techniques specifically. So, like a systematic review, let's say you had a bunch of studies that looked at different technique variations that were strictly defined, and they were all like all studies adopted the same definition of different variations of technique, and then they tested them. Then you could do a systematic review and go, okay, we're going to look at, let's say, strict technique, whatever that means. Let's hypothetically say that has been defined, a lenient technique and non-strict technique. Then you could do a systematic review. But as it stands, we we have barely defined the concept of exercise technique, which in my opinion will require a few more papers that are boring papers for the layman person. Nobody's going to care, but potentially a Delphi study, speaking with experts in the field, coaches, and potentially like physique athletes, if we're talking specifically about muscle growth, because then you'd have to do the same for strength, seeing what people in the field are doing, what they regard as good technique, what they regard as bad technique, and so on and so forth. So this should be viewed as just the first pebble in the, I don't know, where you throw pebbles to build stuff. It's the first sort of piece of the puzzle, but you're still looking at the top corner piece of the puzzle that indicates that you may be looking at a sky or something, but you don't know until you put the puzzle together.
So let me ask you, I shared with you a piece of content that I wanted to reference from Jeff Nippard, but you and Milo have both made videos about the paper as well. Having read the paper and seeing the videos, do you think that the message from the YouTube content matches the paper in those instances? And I'll give you my takeaway first, and then let you,
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
defend or whatever, right? Because the impression I got from the wording and the tone and things is that it was described as new evidence, you know, or that they were like, here's recent foundings, right? You know, based off of it was like, oh, here's what we found, or it was actually presented as that we have now new evidence, which a narrative review doesn't provide new evidence. It's just an opinion on the existing. And that to me seemed somewhat misleading compared to reading the actual, because the paper I think is written, most it's cautious with a lot of the things and stuff like that. But I would not take away that caution. And if I didn't know what I knew, watching that content, I would assume in some of these instances that a actual new study had been done that gathered new evidence showing that range of motion beat out all of the other aspects of technique, for example. That's that's what I could walk away from had I not actually read the paper or kind of understood where it was coming from.
Yeah, I get that. I get that point. I think that comes down to communication and choosing where to place emphasis as far as nuance goes. Because you're specifically referring to Jeff saying something along the lines of one of the most important variables was range of motion or something like that, right? Like
Oh,
that.
it was
That was some.
it was the most important. Range of
Ah,
motion
okay.
was the most important, right?
Yeah, I get that more caution could have been used there, but it may have been just obviously I'm not going to speak for somebody else, but because on the paper it was highlighted that it seems based on the current evidence, it seems that you can be liberal with your training tempo. So if you want to go a bit slower, you can go a bit slower. If you're going to go a bit faster, you can go a bit faster. But the range of motion part of exercise technique and specifically placing emphasis at long muscle lengths and working in those long muscle lengths seems to have seems to be somewhat non-negotiable when it comes to hypertrophy maximization, not obviously making gains in general, and terms and conditions apply. But I think that's why it was expressed like that. Like, if you're going to make any changes to your exercise technique, making sure that you are emphasizing the stretch. If you're the guy who's looking to absolutely maximize hypertrophy, that seems to be like a variable you should really focus on versus really caring about a whole lot more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, my main concern was that it being kind of presented as a new evidence
Yeah,
versus
I
like,
get.
hey, this is after looking at here's the opinion. And when it comes to the range of motion stuff specifically, is there actually evidence that range of motion is superior to all these, or is it just that range of motion right now there's just the more evidence around that topic, and the others would just exist in more of an area of absence of evidence when we're talking about kinematics and the other elements of technique. Because we can't say that they don't matter if we just don't have any evidence for or against. And I think that sometimes that gets construed when we're saying there's no evidence. Is sometimes people don't understand that that means that that doesn't mean that we have evidence against it. It just means there's an absence of any research on the topic, right?
Yeah. And
That
we
that's
have a couple of papers that did show, like for the cows, for example, pointing your toes towards a different direction did lead to different results. So yeah, definitely evidence of absence of evidence ain't evidence of absence.
And I think the CAP study is, I mean, even though that's like the only one that you guys referenced, we have research on looking at using a variety of, we'll say some very similar exercises, basically the same motions. But I think one of the important things, if you guys are going to continue like pursuing this topic of defining technique, is figuring out like when is something a different technique versus when is it a new exercise? So it's okay, if I'm changing my squat, at what point does that squat no longer qualify it as a technique variation? And now I'm calling it a different exercise, right? If I is a heel elevation, is that a technique variation or is that a different squat? Right? Is it moving the bar, right? Does that change it? So I think that is something that's going to need to be somewhat defined for us
Exactly.
to be able to leverage these things. Because if we take, for instance, the calf study and we look at the simplicity of the joint and the action there, right? I mean, plantar flexion is not a super complex movement, right? There's not a lot that you can do to change how force is going through that joint. And so simply moving toes in and toes out is a very subtle, right? I believe that's how you classified what we do, very subtle change in technique, right? And that made a difference at a very simple joint. And so we have other joints that have significantly more freedom. And so the changes in technique could theoretically be much more drastic. But yet even that subtle one was able to show a difference, right? And this is a question I get a lot of times when, because we'll show, hey, here's how to bias the short head versus the long head of the biceps, for example. And people are like, how much can you really bias one head over the others, right? And I don't have a hypertrophy study to reference that. I have to rely on, hey, here's what we have in terms of biomechanics. This one is it's taking this portion of the tissue to a longer muscle length. Here's what we have on EMG. Here's what we have on muscle oxygenation. Here's the anecdotal experiences and observations from the field. And then I could basically say it would be pretty surprising if there wasn't a difference, but giving you a magnitude of difference is a very
Yeah.
hard thing to do without that longitudinal evidence. So here's how you can choose to use that or take that as a reason to not say it's not worth it, right? It comes down to a return on investment whenever you're going to start applying more nuances to your training. So I just think that's like that part of the conversation of, I mean, if we're going to talk about kinematics as an element of technique, what actually falls under kinematics? Because the message, for instance, that I got from Milo's video was like, all right, we don't have a lot of data on kinematics and it's complicated. Ignore that one, focus on just the range of motion. But to my understanding, range of motion is actually under the umbrella of kinematics. And in practice, what we do in terms of, okay, where you place your feet and how you decide to go through the movement actually does influence range of motion. And it is
Mm.
also in some exercises going to influence where the exercise is challenging. So take for example, the row that you were doing in your video, the one where you were like adjusting the guy's thumb, like
Oh,
one
yeah.
millimeter this way, that way, or whatever, right? All right. So it's a hammer strength row. Most people that are watching this have probably seen one or used one.
Was
It's a matrix, but the same
Is it the same?
exact
Sorry,
design, right? All of them they're all the same with just, but you take something like that, right? And that has a resistance challenge that is very hard in the short position, very easy in the lengthened position, as is. If you just follow the stickers in the machine, you sit up there, you use the chest pad, that's how it is. It's actually more short biased than if you were to do a dumbbell row, because you've got to combine your mechanics with the external resistance of the machine, right? And both of those are
Mm.
favoring towards it being harder in the short, right? So if we take the the very subtle adjustments of just stepping back, right, and performing that exercise with an extended arm so that we just move the body in backwards relative to the motion, we now take it from being an exercise that was hard in the short to hardest at the stretch, similar to the prime row that you guys used at RP. So I can take that same exercise that otherwise would be a very short bias challenge and turn it into a lengthened bias challenge with just the subtle change in the kinematics. I can completely 180, even though it's not a degrees thing, but I can completely flip the resistance challenge from being harder on the short end to harder on the lengthened end just by standing in a slightly different spot and putting my hand against the pad instead of my chest. So when it comes to the kinematics thing, we don't have a lot of research on, hey, what if my toes are this way versus that way on every squat or whatnot? But there are a lot of elements in terms of kinematics that are directly influencing the things that we do have research on, such as range of motion, such as actually making something more challenging in the lengthened position. And then that doesn't even get into the utility of looking at these things from, oh, okay, the difference between having your toes this way versus this way in the field is the difference between somebody having pain versus no pain in the exercise and understanding that element. But we don't need to go into that portion of it. I think that's probably too complex for this conversation. But I think understanding that range of motion and maybe even tempo, depending on how you define it, actually falls under the kinematics, and that we do have a lot of examples where actually the kinematics can influence these exercises in ways where we do have evidence supporting.
Yeah, but I fully agree, and that's why on the paper we say specifically that However, existing research, blah, 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 is limited. It is therefore suggested that universal exercise specific kinematic guidelines are followed and adopted in accordance with the above recommendations. As in, like, exactly what you said. You're trying to, if you're trying to, again, this is all in the context of maximizing hypertrophy, right? This is not in the context of making gains or making substantial muscle gains. It's in the context of, I want to make every educated bet possible that I am doing everything that I can to maximize muscle growth in this case. But if you were to follow if you were to take like a basic sort of squat demonstration where they will tell you something as generic as have your feet shoulder slightly wider than shoulder width, squat down this way and that way. By then trying to adapt those kinematics to the recommendations on range of motion, so getting a full stretch on your quads, and then you know that your tempo can be relatively flexible. Don't you think that ticks most, if not all, boxes?
To me, it's not it's taking away of how important that aspect of the field could be, even though we don't have that much evidence on it. To me, yes, it's accurate what you're saying, but I believe it's slightly dismissive of the importance of that portion of it. Now, if I'm going a little bit further in terms of just my critique of the paper in general, a couple questions that I would have is, all right, if I remember right, does the paper actually say that we need to be adjusting so that we have on average, longer muscle length, or just get to longer muscle lengths in general?
I think it's the latter
Yeah.
with the slight
And
asterisk.
if I'm correct, the actual conclusions or the consensus that we have around this topic is it's the average muscle length. Like, we want to set up so we have on average a longer muscle length.
Mhm.
Because we do have, for instance, the preacher curl versus the incline curl study. And we have the tricep study with the mostly mid-range, but just slightly lengthened partial versus. So in both of those instances, the exercise that went to an absolute longer muscle length was not the better exercise in terms of hypertrophy outcome. It was the exercise that either was on average the longer muscle length or was just simply more challenging on average at a longer length, but was not simply the long length. So I found that was something that was missing from the topic of, oh, we should be, we
I'll
should just
tell
be
you
going
why.
to longer muscle lengths. Okay.
Yeah, so it's not necessary because I said the former, but I think it's a mixture of the former and the latter. Because we say that based on the current literature, it appears that utilizing a range of motion that biases longer muscle lengths should be the default approach to exercise technique when trying to maximize hypertrophy. Although transversing the end ROM at shorter lengths, blah blah blah, may not be adding an extra benefit. More research on different ROM configurations is needed to draw stronger conclusions. Additionally, current literature on long muscle length training is limited to a few muscles, and thus more research is needed to understand whether some muscles may be predisposed to longer length training than others. But all that to say that one challenging thing with writing this paper, because this paper was a bit of a mindfuck, was to be very mindful of not discussing methods that separating technique from training methods, because then giving you exactly ways that you could go about this general recommendation that could manifest itself in many different ways. Does that make sense? Because we
Yeah.
had started. Yeah, sorry. Aaron. Go on.
Yeah. One of my things similar to like how we need to figure out what the line is between technique and exercise was also like, okay, is technique something that applies to a single rep versus I would think methodologies would be things that would apply to a set as a whole, right?
Mhm.
For instance, like our training to failure in one, you could argue that training to failure is a technique, but to me, that falls under a programming technique rather than a exercise technique. When it comes to getting into detail about length and bias stuff is following more under the programming technique rather than the exercise itself.
I'm saying that the way you implement, the way you take these practical recommendations and implement them in practice, then how you adjust in order for an exercise to bias longer muscle lengths, and this has turned into yet another muscle length podcast, is it can manifest in many different ways. So in this paper, we needed to be cautious with not going, because like originally I had mentioned ways you could go about this is you could do either partials or emphasize the stretch or do integrated partials and so on and so forth. But we decided to leave that out because that would then be discussing different methods that you could sort of make up based on those general recommendations.
My
But
opinion, if I throw it out there, is if I'm thinking of you guys applying this stuff consistently, I look at integrated partials or partials in general. Like I think those fall under kinematics, and to a degree, like you could look at integrated partials as also a facet of tempo, right? As well, right? Because that's
Mhm.
what we're doing, right? Is we're throwing in this partial rep, but it's basically taking the quote unquote time under tension that we're accumulating and making it more in the lengthened exposure portions. To me, I actually think that's just my opinion. I actually think those do fit in that section, but this is where the challenging thing is you have to put the line somewhere, right? But from my experience, I would include those things in that if we're talking about making something lengthen biased, right? Deciding like what elements that can be in here. I think if tempo fits under there, then I think that partials probably also would, because I would see those things as similar. But that's, I mean, again, this was an opinion
Yeah,
paper. That's just my opinion, right?
sure. Yeah, with tempo, then we would need to get into potential combinations of tempo and how those could be used, and then it opens up. It essentially goes beyond the scope of the paper, at least in our opinion. So, like a different paper could be, uh, like it could be again either a narrative review or an opinion paper, or because it wouldn't be original research, where you would take the information of this paper as a base and be like, based on that paper, it was mentioned that you need to bias longer muscle lengths based on the current literature. Okay, in practice, what are some ways that you can go about doing this? Here are some recommendations, and then go into a full in-depth discussion in why, exactly as you said, like you mentioned some caveats, and you were like, if you do this on this exercise, it will place more load or average long muscle lengths and so on and so forth. But then those are also so nuanced that you'd need a whole paper in order to discuss them and pick on the indirect literature that exists in some cases. Does that make sense? So it would be
So,
like a methods, like how to take this information and actually apply it into practice, or but it would need a very lengthy discussion, in my opinion, in order to flesh out each method properly and discuss all the nuance that goes around it versus just throwing it casually in there in the form of a couple of sentences.
okay. So my question then is that, do you think that doesn't belong on this paper simply because the objective of this paper was to keep it to a certain length or a certain brevity in terms of the topic and nuance that it covered? Was that part of the objective of this? Was there like a keep it simple aspect to it? Because I mean, I've seen narrative reviews that are small books before.
Yeah, so it would fall outside of the scope of the paper, because the scope of the paper was again to synthesize evidence on what constitutes an optimal approach to training technique for maximize hypertrophy, versus looking at ways that you can take technique and adjust it, and different sort of practical methods that you can implement. If that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, it could have been, yeah, we could have done a 20,000 word narrative review that has multiple parts, and part one is this. We've done multi experiment papers before, but yeah, it fell outside of the scope of this, and we thought that it would be way too much, way too much information on one paper, and it would lead to some confusion. Whereas now, if you had one paper specifically on long muscle length, because at the moment we don't have that, we have meta-analytic data on range of motion and showing that, oh, partials at long muscle lengths based on the literature seem to be equal, or in some cases slightly better than full range of motion. We have some original research that does show, there's new studies that came out on the cows, for example, recently, that show that, oh, training at low muscle lengths in the form led to more growth, blah, 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 blah. But we don't have a paper at the moment that says, okay, there's all this research hype around training at long muscle lengths. How does that, what are some potential ways, again, very exploratory, and that would also be in the form probably of a narrative review. What are some potential ways that you can include that data in your practice, and an appropriate discussion behind each recommendation, and whether, and in order to support whether it makes sense or it doesn't.
So is that in the pipeline then to have a paper that's just on each of these elements that expands the practical aspect, or go deeper into it, one on tempo, one on range of motion, one on, or several maybe on the different elements of kinematics?
The one thing that is in the pipeline is a study on training techniques specifically, which will happen this summer. Those papers in my pipeline, no. In other people's pipelines, maybe. The first things first in my head is to actually do a study where we have people train with, actually, we're going to take these variables that we identified, slightly modify them, and see that whether in practice having somebody follow an optimally sort of configured, from a technique standpoint, resistance training program makes a difference to not doing that, and potentially even going as far as having not poor technique but more less strict technique. There's a, and that's where what I'm fleshing out now, and that's where we're also going to use expert opinion in order to inform or at least to assess the technique of the participants in the study, so that it's not just based on what we think is optimal technique and what is not, and to have a set of coaches and athletes from physique sports that will be essentially grading the technique of the participants without necessarily knowing who's in what group and so on and so forth.
Yeah, because I feel like a lot of the field has, I think when most people, at least from my perspective, like when they hear the word technique, it's synonymous with form, which would be mostly like the kinematic portion of it. So I'd be interesting to see like how actually what you guys come up with in terms of design and your take on optimizing a technique, right? And also then like how you choose to measure that, right? I mean, is it a technique and we're just measuring, say, are you guys doing squat technique and are we just going to measure the lateralis, or are you going to measure all of the quadriceps in multiple sites? Because if you look at, I believe one of the studies that probably is closest to this was they looked at varied exercise versus just doing one exercise for hypertrophy. And there was not a significant difference in overall hypertrophy, but the regional aspect of hypertrophy was very different in the varied group, even though I believe the total hypertrophy did still trend with the varied group, but almost every element of the study trended towards the varied group, but not all of it reached statistical significance. But I mean, it was, they were doing the quadriceps, and one group did just, I think they did just like squats, maybe leg extensions and something else or whatever. I can't remember. And the other group did some sort of deadlift and they did very motion. But this is where like, when is it a technique? When is it an exercise? Right. Because the body doesn't know like when the name of the motion changes. Right.
Exactly.
Like it's all on a gradient. So it's okay. When does a squat become a hack squat, or whatever it is, and those sorts of elements. Right. And kind of defining that. Right. Because in reality, it's, if we look at the tools that we have in the gym, we put names on things oftentimes just because things are just occurring in a different space, or we're just simply
Yep.
using a different object, but kinematically, like the motion may otherwise be the same, and we may have the same variation options in both things, right? It's okay. Like the things that I can do in a hack squat are very similar to the things that I can do in a pendulum squat or a leg press. There's subtle differences and stuff, but I mean, I can use the same variations of foot positions and different ways of manipulating the loading, et cetera. And my
Mhm.
intention into the foot plate, whether I'm like actually trying to push up a little bit versus keep my weight in my heels and all. So you can probably like, if we were to put the impact of these things on a scale, even though the exercise names change, there's probably a lot of overlapping between those where it's okay. If you apply one technique to this exercise, it's the same as X technique with we can make things very similar, even though they exist under different brand names of exercise, just like the hammer row versus the matrix row. What do we call those? Do we call those both just, are they both just chest supported rows? Because in some chest supported rows, the arms go out and some they come in, and some have a lengthened challenge and some have a shortened challenge and whatever. So do we have to have a different exercise name for every row machine ever made, right? This one has rubber. So it's a different tactile experience than the knurling that makes you feel more hardcore and badass. I'm being
It's
pedantic
just
there, but
not at all. Yeah, you are, but not at all. In as in, it's not a bad thing. One question I have for you, and that's completely out of curiosity, is: do you think that, based on the practical recommendation off the back of this paper, in the sense that, hey, make sure that you're biasing long muscle lengths and utilizing a repetition tempo of 2 to 8 seconds while controlling the eccentric, do you think that one is ticking most or all boxes? I mean, I don't think you're going to say all, but do you think one is ticking most boxes as far as like making sure that when they're performing an exercise, they're getting as much hypertrophy as possible from that exercise?
I think I would say yes, it's ticking most of the boxes, but what it's doing is that with tempo and range of motion, it's covering those more tangibly. And then from the kinematics perspective, it's very ambiguous, right? Because
Mhm.
it's very easy to say, oh, yeah, just set it up so that it targets the desired muscle tissue or whatever, which is okay. What are the principles behind how we do that? I think like a small, because you don't have to go into every individual exercise, but you could go into, okay, what does it mean that we set up an exercise that it's targeting that tissue? Does that mean that, okay, the motion matches the action of the desired target tissues? Or I would have liked some description or some more detail on what makes good kinematics follow that. Because ultimately, I mean, to apply range of motion in training, you're going to have some understanding of the kinematics in a lot of exercises because it's not everything is a bicep curl where you can just, oh, this is super simple. I just be uppy, downy, elbow flexioning. Like some things, like if you're talking about it, oh, get the deepest stretch in your pecs in a chest press. And you're like, okay, that's so use the deepest range of motion. The grip width that you choose and the angle motion that you choose or whatever are going to determine how much absolute range of motion you get. And they're also going to determine which portion of the pec is getting at a longer muscle length, right? You
Mhm.
can't get a full stretch in the lower pec and an upper pec at the same time, right? One stretch is going up this way, the other one stretch is going. That's just the same thing for the lats, right? They can't. The upper lats stretch the most in protraction, but the lower lats stretch the most in elevation. And if I do all of the protraction, I can't get the elevation. If I do all of the elevation, then I can't get the protraction. So there's elements in there that influence the range of motion. So I think not. I think it came off to me that a little dismissive of the importance of that and how that range of motion technically is a subset of the kinematics, at least
Yeah,
in my
but
opinion.
if we're seeing
Um,
from the evidence on range of motion that the effect of range of motion overall seems to be trivial, and I don't know about the importance part, not between us, obviously, but do you think that, let's say you had somebody and you showed them, like, you took, I don't know, the most generic sort of exercise demonstration book or resource that shows, here's how you do a bench press: grab the bar, bring it down to your chest, bring it up. Here's how you do a lat pull down: grab the bar, bring it to the top of your chest, and so on and so forth. And you showed them all those, you showed them the most basic technique guidelines. Range of motion was this sort of full range of motion without a real emphasis on long muscle lengths or any sort of adjustment. You'd be talking about like a powerlifting squat where you're slightly below parallel, bench press with a normal bar, or like a normal push up without an added deficit. If you were to put a percentage to it, how much of a difference do you think for hypertrophy those adjustments would make in the long term? Let's say intensity of effort is very high, training to failure, or at least very close to, and then you take two twins. One person does the most optimal adjustments. You have them there at N1, and I have them at M1. I'm just telling them, yo, just make sure intensity is high. They've bought into whatever we're doing. Both twins have completely bought into your stuff, and not to my stuff, but to like just adhering to resistance training guidelines. Do you think, how much of a difference do you think it will make?
I think it's going to be on a spectrum in terms of some exercises just naturally already include a lot of these things, right? For instance, a bench press is already close to a lengthened challenge exercise. If you just, okay, I just grab the bar and I bring it down to my chest, it's already a little bit more biased towards a lengthened challenge. And I'm at a relatively long muscle length there. And it's not an extremely difficult motion to do, right? In terms of setup and technique and whatever, right? Now,
Mhm.
so in that instance, we're talking trivial differences. So maybe if you combine all of the best elements together, maybe you're at a 5% difference, right? You get a couple percent, for, all right, maybe I could emphasize the stretch a little bit more. Maybe I could, you know, utilize, the tempo, in the best way. Maybe I could have my positioning in a way to get me just a little bit more longer length or to bias one portion of the pack a little bit. So small percent. Now, on the other side, there are exercises that naturally don't have a lot of these qualities just built in. So take your pull down example, which, okay, if I'm using a wide grip bar like this, okay, that's
Mhm.
going to limit my ability to stretch because if I'm just out here like this, I have to come in like this to stretch the lats more, right? You'd have to. So then it's okay. And it's not inherently challenging at the lengthened position. So either utilizing a specialty machine that challenges it there or using lengthened partials or some other strategy to do that. That's where I think, okay, on that instance, maybe now we get into the double digits and if we're applying all these things, maybe now we're getting into, cool, maybe I could make up to a 20% difference over time because the exercise in its base point was towards like if we were saying like what would be the worst way to design an exercise, okay, we would be eliminating the lengthened position, it would be
Mhm.
hardest in the short position, et cetera, et cetera. There's a ton of, okay, do I lean back and rock, and there's so many options there and whatnot. So it's okay in that instance there, choosing a very optimized technique for that probably makes a significant difference, whereas another exercise where optimal is not really different
It's
from
already
just the
baked in
exercise.
there. Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's also where some people are like, oh, I have a strong body part and a weak body part or whatever. There, in my opinion, there always tends to be this general trend of how many times have you heard that you need to train chest twice as much as back? Have you ever
Yeah,
heard that?
for
But,
sure.
but, but,
And I was always like, "Where's that based? What's that based on?"
but you've probably heard from a ton of different sources that you should train back more than chest, right? Like that's been like
100%. And the
now,
posture bullshit as well.
Now, if we just take that as just, all right, somebody just came up with that idea randomly or whatever, but if we actually examine the most traditional exercises, most traditional chest exercises are actually closer, like most of the good things are already baked in, but it's the opposite for most back exercises.
Hmm.
Most back exercises don't get you to they don't get you to the same degree of length that your chest
Mhm.
exercises do, right? Now, if you do a row and you let protraction happen, cool, you're getting most of the way there. You're not missing a
Mm.
ton if you were to say bring the arm across the body. But in terms of a pull down or for like the lower iliac lats or the lumbar lats, if we're not actually getting the elevation, if there's no trunk motion and no adduction, et cetera, we're leaving a lot of muscle lengths on the table in those exercises. And those exercises are all pretty light in the lengthened position relatively to the short, right? So if you look at, man, we see these anecdotes over time and they correlate directly with just the natural conditions that those muscles are trained in. Is it Would it be unreasonable that the conclusion that some of these people in the field would have, it takes me twice, like I have to train my back twice as much as I do my chest. But that's because all of the exercises that they're using for their back are somewhat less effective. And they're also going to play into things like, yeah, lengthened stuff tends to make you a little bit more sore, especially when you first try it. And we don't know this from a research perspective, but anecdotally, there tends to be somewhat of a greater fatigue cost and soreness, et cetera. But I think the stimulus is worth it in that endeavor. But if we see that, to me, it's not a surprise that people started gravitating towards adapting their volume to the responses that they were seeing from those exercises, knowing that, okay, they were getting a per set, same amount of effort, they were getting a lower dose response to a set of back than they were
Mm.
a set of chest, because the exercise they were doing just naturally, one side had the good stuff baked in and the other was missing some of those important elements.
Yeah, that's a good point. So essentially, what you're saying is, if only our paper existed back in the day to tell them to buy us long muscle lengths, and all their problems would have been solved.
But yeah,
Joking
then
aside,
maybe the 2 to 1 never happens, right? Maybe it just is
yeah,
just find a way to make your back exercises better, and it could be a 1 to 1.
just for the sake of the 2-to-1 sort of recommendation, I think a lot of stemmed from the posture craze back in that time. If you remember, like, correcting your posture was the thing in our field, like circa, I don't know, 2010, 2030. In those years, there was a lot of talk about posture and how it affects your health. And face pulls were the thing, if you remember, for shoulder health, where if you ask, hey, what does that really mean? And the answer can be a bit all over the place. But yeah, that's actually, I hadn't thought about that, the
Yeah,
way you
I
put
think
it.
the
That's
posture
interesting.
element probably played a role in that being popular in maybe the S&C community and more of the
Mhm.
functional training, but in the bodybuilding community, because none of those guys are really concerned about their posture unless they're posing. I saw the same message going on there, but for a totally different reason. That it
Yeah,
was
for
all
sure.
related. It was all related to gains, right? Again, these are just observations, and we don't know causation or whatnot. But to me, I find it interesting that, and I just use that example, but there's others that I have, right, in terms of quads and hams and et cetera. If we go through the body and we were just to say, okay, if we look at the most traditional exercises and we ranked them on like how close are they to what we could do in terms of optimizing muscle length and resistance challenge, et cetera, and we ranked them there, I would say that there is probably a decent correlation between people complaining about certain muscle groups and stuff like that. And then there's also just some habitual thing. Like the calves is always the running joke, right? But it's because everybody like they throw their calves in at the end of
The
it,
end,
or whatever, right?
half-assed.
Because nobody wants to go super hard on calves and then go squat or whatever. They look at calves like forearms, for example. They look at more as an afterthought, because unless everybody's doing seated calf raises, and then you could argue if on average the population had been doing more seated calf raises than straight knee, then they wouldn't have been getting as
Yeah, it may have
lengthened
been that as well.
of a gastrocnemius, right? So I don't know, I find these things interesting. So when you ask me how big of a difference does it make, my answer is it depends on how close the exercise is there, right? So if we are seeing these, you know, trivial to, in some cases, I would say substantial effects in terms of the range of motion impact. Some of these studies I mean, it's significant. It's a meaningful difference. Granted, some of
Exactly.
them are in untrained populations and whatnot. So we have to take everything in context. But the way I look at like nuances in training is one of the hard things about looking at these things in research is that we're always just isolating one
Mm.
and we're never compounding them together, right? So it's okay, cool. We're looking at, all right, range of motion in a squat and we're going deeper. But are we doing the things that would also capitalize on biasing the torque towards the knee? Like we could if we were giving people a heel elevation and having them use a technique where they were trying to move their knees forward and things like that. And then we were actually looking at, okay, what if we're doing all those things and we're getting into the greatest amount of knee flexion this person could under the most, we'll say, ascending resistance challenge that's like peaking at the bottom relative to the top, and minimizing how much they have to incorporate the glutes. So it's more specific to the quads as well, right? And we're losing less neurological drive to also having a lot of load on hip extension, et cetera, and whatnot. Okay. To me, I look at, okay, if we add all those things up, do they compound in any way? Is there an exponential benefit? I don't know, but they're not, at least from my perspective. Once you kind of understand the foundation foundational principles. These aren't hard things to implement, right? They're not like, oh, I had no brain power for the rest of the week because I thought about lifting my heels on the squat and putting my knees forward. And I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
somehow
sure.
the way that nuances look like. It's like, oh, optimal is, if you focus on optimal, you can't work hard, or you forget how to eat, and you don't know how to progressively overload anymore. And I'm like, that's not
I've
how that
been
works.
there. I've been there defending you guys though, the past few weeks, because like the pendulum swung to the point where, and I'm finding my sort of space in the space, if I may. But the pendulum swung from, oh, everything must be optimized, to, okay, optimal is now, stop caring so much. But at the same time, look, for a lot of people, it's fun. It can make a meaningful difference. That's another thing. Who defines meaningful? And yeah, if you are somebody who doesn't want to miss out on any gains, or if like you're a coach who wants to learn more so that you can use that with the appropriate clientele, that's totally fine, and definitely fits there. And I don't think that, as you said, like mental looking, going on somebody's profile and seeing all this information sort of spread can be, or at least from my perspective, somewhat intimidating for some people, especially if they don't know better. They'd be like, "Whoa, this guy is demonstrating all these exercises so differently, and they're talking about adjustments. I need to learn each one of them." But then, if you actually look into it, it's relatively easy adjustments that you can make in the pursuit of maximizing your gains, and that's totally fine.
This is my favorite way to kind of put this when it comes down to training nuances, specifically when it comes down to like specificity and bias. If you're of the opinion that we can't do much to bias different muscles or different divisions of muscles. So take the short head, long head biceps. If I say, oh, hey, here's an exercise that it biceps short head, here's an exercise that biceps long head. If you're under the assumption that's not possible, you can't do that, then guess what? That means that both exercises are equally good at elbow flexion. That means that if it's impossible to get the bias, then that means that both of them, they're basically equally good, right? And if you believe that it is possible, then there's a potential benefit. At worst case scenario, if you want to take the most cynical view on applying nuance to training, you'd be like, all right, then you just have different ways of accomplishing the same thing. That's like the most cynical view that you could take. But there also could be a potential benefit that you could choose exercises that more closely suit your goal or allow you to, like, one of the simple ways, because people are like, do you really need to, like, focus on just one head of the biceps? I mean, what we find in practice is that when we use bias exercises, that it allows us to actually have a greater performance, across volume, because it's all right. And you could make the argument that that's not the best approach. Sometimes you don't want to be biased. Sometimes you need an exercise that does a lot over a few amount of sets because that's what you have to work with. And then in other times you're trying to actually trying to figure out, how do I push more volume and manage performance and fatigue? And it's okay if we use more biased exercises. This one exercise, if I perform it this way, allows me to then have increased performance in this other way because that particular portion of the tissue is not as fatigued or is not as sore, et cetera. Right. So it's okay, cool. If I do the short head over here and the long head over here, there's less influence across those two versus if I did an exercise that was kind of integrated across both and then just tried to do a second exercise that have a bigger performance drop off. Now, whether one of those approaches is absolutely superior, I don't know, but I like having the option, and it allows me to have a lot of flexibility in fitting the programming to an individual, right? Because it's okay, cool. If frequency is tighter, what do I have? I can either manage volume or I can manage my exercise selection and technique so that we can be able to accomplish what we need to in a given frequency, right? And if
Yeah.
somebody's got a particular goal that's like a little bit more nuanced, cool. I have a tool that at worst case is the same, and at best case is allowing me to help them be a little bit more specific with their results. Now, I can tell you that my observations, and this is obviously a completely biased take because it's coming from me on my own stuff, is that, yeah, we have really good success of actually getting people to grow in more specific areas, right? I
Mm.
think the challenge is that people lose the context that hypertrophy is a generally slow process in general. And what people expect, like the assumption that people have is, oh, if I try this super nuanced biased exercise, that I should somehow get hypertrophy at 10 times the rate that I normally get. And I'm like, no, you're gonna shift the bias of your gains a little bit more towards that tissue and maybe get like a small percentage increase in that. But it's not like you're gonna be able to do something for 6 weeks and your physique looks totally different, right? Because you're not just gonna grow a tumor in one part of the muscle. And I think that's a tough thing is that if we're talking about all these things and the fact that they make a small difference on something that already moves in a small amount, not only does it make it that hard to research, but it also makes it hard to see those results in the field if people aren't actually willing to commit it. But people like to program hop. So what are they going to do? They're going to try something for, oh, I did whatever I did, iliac pull downs for 4 weeks and I couldn't then jump off of buildings and fly with my lats after that. Then I guess they don't work. Right now, we don't get that very often, but I know that there are plenty of people on the other side of the spectrum of things that want to take this approach. Oh yeah, I tried that once and I didn't notice this or that or whatever. And I'm like, okay, but did you really try it? Did you really actually dial in the technique, or did you just do something 70% close to what you saw some influencer do, which was a bad copy of what we're doing already? And you did it for 2 sessions and be like, yep, didn't make a difference. Didn't feel it. Didn't have all the disruption or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. That's not a real good way to evaluate this stuff sometimes. I'm biased towards looking at, hey, if I if the worst case scenario, and this is what Milo says on range of motion. Okay, worst case scenario, you get the same results from doing like the partials in most of these cases, right? And but potentially there's a positive. Not for this discussion, but I think there are potential places, and we've talked about this privately, and probably do it on a podcast in the future of where I think there may be places where lengthened partials actually might be because they just limit the volume load that you can do because of respiratory limitations or whatever they may be. But anyway, I don't know how much time that you have left, but I have just a couple more things
Sure.
here if you're still good.
Hit me.
All right. So I think we're pretty much tied up on the technique and the narrative review thing. So I would like to get back into our leading topic of, okay, looking into, all right, science-based content, et cetera. And I think like I listened to what your guys' conversation with Bromley, and I'm actually going to talk to him, I think next week. I listened to the thing with Helms, and what I was kind of hoping for is a way forward. Like, what are some possible solutions, like steps to like, how do we get the pendulum to fall back to the middle on some of these things? And I'm curious if you have any black pill or white pill thoughts about the current situation and what your thoughts are on how can we get the pendulum to swing back towards the middle.
I think it just naturally swings after a point. But keep in mind, man, we've dedicated our lives to something really cool for us, which is lifting weights and gaining muscle. And but at the same time, I think because it's all it's not straightforward. I mean, it is, but yeah, there's a lot more to uncover. But like the gist of it for a lot of the people that are fueling these debates, because it's not like we're having them behind closed doors, and it's just geeks geeking out, like practice geeks versus science geeks geeking out. But there seems to be people that side with science or with practice. I think it's just something that comes with any scene. Like we want to have the latest thing that we need to debate about, and we have the bad scientists or the bad practitioners or whatever, and it will naturally swing back to the middle at some point until there's something else, and then we shift our focus to that. I don't have hope. I don't have much hope in the sense that it will never be perfect. I am, because it seems like no matter the disclaimers, no matter the fucking practical experience, no matter, like, we're publishing papers, and I'm gonna vent now. We're publishing papers using our coaches and athletes as the source of data. We're interviewing them. You put out the fucking interview study on deloads, and people go, "Yeah, that's just an interview study. You just asked a bunch of people." Then you get the study on the literature, people will say, yeah, the studies are flawed, untrained individuals, blah, 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 strawman criticisms. We are individuals who lift, who are strong, at least for like general gym standards, right? Not for like elite powerlifting standards. We have a decent amount of muscle. We are coaches who do emphasize a lot of the minute details and act on an evidence of absence of evidence and evidence of absence basis. And we try to convey that. We're putting disclaimers on disclaimers on disclaimers on disclaimers, and people will still go, yeah, the science based. They're complicating again, or they're talking about. Oh man, it's just they don't seem to want to listen one or the other side as well, because you'll see it on both ends of the spectrum. So from my end, we should do our best to continuously push the idea that evidence based is scientific evidence as the base, practice on top, preference as well. Not everything needs a study to be a potential to be useful or produce results. Same, because take powerlifting, for example, competitive powerlifting. And because I've coached a lot of powerlifters, and I currently still coach powerlifters, and my PhD was on powerlifting, there's many practices. There's no study on powerlifting accessories, or there's a lot of stuff that we see in the field that is being done, and it's fine that it's not science based, and that is viewed as okay. Then, on the other hand, when we have limited evidence on something, people that don't like that something will go, there's limited evidence from either sides, either the scientific side or the practical side. And it just seems like it's a war of like bias, egos, and it's just a bit of a shit show in general, man. Is it that deep to go, yeah, we need the science. Obviously, be cautious when interpreting that science. Context matters. If it's you and I now here 3 hours deep talking about maximizing muscle for the few freaks in the world that want to absolutely maximize their side delt growth, that's a different context. That context matters when we're talking about stuff. We're not talking about growing a bunch of muscle and being absolutely jacked out of your mind for most people's standards. We're also geeking out for the sake of geeking out, and that's also fine in that context. I don't know. All that to say, what can we do? You saw the debate. Like, we had the debate, and it was just like we were going in circles. No shade or offense thrown to Alex, but we were there. We made our points. Two of us. I tried to use like practical examples as well. It didn't seem to go anywhere. I don't know. I'm not left with a ton of hope. I think we can. All we can do is just put out good information with the appropriate disclaimers, highlight the context, highlight the limitations, highlight what truly evidence-based means, and at the end of the day, whoever listens, whoever doesn't, let them comment, whatever.
Do you think there's I mean, or maybe it's just easy to say yes because this is a human thing, but do you think there is a particular ego or entitlement from some actors in the academic space, right? Like,
Want to open that kind of worms?
yeah,
We can. Have you read? Okay, I'm gonna pimp out the usual book I pimp out. Have you read Science Fictions?
science fictions. I have not.
Anyways, it's a book called Science Fictions, How Fraud, Bias, Negligence, and Hype Undermine the Search of Truth. We have documented cases in medical science where multiple people have died because of egos and bias. And if you Google Paolo Macchiarini, I think that's his name, he sort of frauded a trachea implant procedure. And he was like anyways, I'm not gonna open that kind of words. Yeah, for sure. In the academic world,
Specifically to the exercise science realm, though.
Yeah.
Let's stay in our area, right? I mean, here's some things that I've experienced. We'll say double standards in certain examples or in certain situations,
Let me
right?
give
So,
you an
like,
example. I'm not gonna name anybody, but I'm gonna say that the 52 set study comes out. Okay. It's a study, first of all. Like, we have studies on extreme stretching. Nobody cared that much when that study came out on the cow. 7 hours of stretching per week. We all looked at it. We were like, oh, cool. That's how I looked at the 52 set study. And it's not a 52 set study. They did those sets for 2 weeks. Let's stop calling it that. They ramped up. It was an extreme design. Terms of conditions apply approximately to RIR, blah, 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 blah. And it's the growth. People are highlighting that the growth was not statistically significant. And it's, bro, when the diet break meta-analysis came out now, that shows that diet breaks resulted in a statistically significant change in resting metabolic rate, everybody was quick to say, yeah, but look, that means X amount of calories, which is not really practically significant. Therefore, we don't care about this practical significance because we want to see what's practically meaningful, which we did in our studies by asking coaches and athletes what they think is practically meaningful. But then people look at the N study and they like, look at the effect sizes. It was a small sample. Maybe that's what affected practical significance. You can look at it and be like, the change in growth is probably not a big deal for the majority of people who are just going to the gym. But for some bodybuilders or for the freaks that we deal with, for the person that is paying me X amount of money per month and is packed, I want to absolutely maximize muscle growth. There may be something to that there. I'm not saying everything is going to be 52 sets per week, but there may be something to, oh, your delts are lagging. Let's try 35 sets per week. Do something extreme just in case that helps.
Let
What do
me
you think?
ask you that, because I think this is as good of a like validity that we can get would be to see how many people actually take and apply that study to
Nobody,
their
bro.
coaching, right? I mean, you
No,
did
but
the
nobody
workout with
said
Milo. But you like, how are you feeling after the squats?
the fact, and let me say this as well on record. We went, so Milo has always been training legs properly, but he wasn't doing much volume. He was doing, I think, like maybe max 10 sets per week at the time, and we were traveling, sure, we're in New York. Maybe that's something people don't know, and probably they don't, but I haven't really been training. Like, I am somebody who's naturally strong when it comes to their legs, and I've been deadlifting and doing some form, like 1 to 2 sets of something for my quads per week to maintain my quads there. Lately, all I've been doing is one single set of a single or a triple on the squat. Literally all my training. So we went into that, and we were 3 people, and we said, okay, there was a challenge, $1,000. And I said, okay, let's all do it. I can push myself through, even if I puke a couple of times. Freaks, I'm going to, because that, like, doing, what was it, 23 sets or 26? Whatever. That's 900% more volume than usual. But we clarified before, and we found out that only one person will get paid. So the other friend said, guys, and the other friend was also completely unprepared, wasn't even resistance training at the time. Boxer friend of mine who was just like, yeah, let's make some money. So he said, fuck it, bro, I'm not gonna do the workout for camaraderie's sake. I said, I'll attempt it. Just I'll be there. If it gets too much, I'm not gonna push myself. Keep in mind, we were trying to keep not just obviously the volume, and I got through all the squat sets, and that was already, I think, 700% more volume than I had done up for the past 2 years. And after squats, because we were being very strict with rest times, and even though the study said minimum of 2 minutes, we tried our best to keep it at 2 minutes. And if you look at the duration of the video, that includes my sets as well, it was exactly as much as reported on the study as far as the average duration. And that's including me working in as well. So we finished the squats. I'm feeling nauseous because I'm resting almost 2 minutes between sets doing sets of, what was it, 6 to 8 reps, which I haven't done. And I was like, look, I'm not gonna just push it now. Just to push it. I felt very accomplished. It was a lot of fun to go through that torture. But then we also decided to keep that in there because we're like, oh, who cares? Like, we're being transparent. Yeah, obviously it's a hard workout. It's out there. We could have easily said a friend will only do the squat portion just for the fuck of it, and that's that. But like, we left it there. We could have, based on the agreement and the terms and conditions, we could have just omitted that. We could have omitted me from the video as well, and could have just focused on Milo completing the thing and being fully biased and saying, yeah, he did it, and that was it. Like, why throw me in the mix as well and cause any doubts? But like, if you listen to any discussion about that study, there's a podcast on Revive Stronger with myself, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, Dr. Milo Wolf, aka Brad and Milo. No, nobody's practical takeaways really changed. We saw that study. Our knee-jerk reaction, hand to God, the life of my parents, was, oh man, before it came out, we were like, fuck, now people are going to be saying 52 sets is the best for muscle growth. That was our initial reaction. And then we read it. We were like, maybe the threshold is higher. We'll see. And that was it.
I probably saw half a dozen YouTube titles quoting the like, oh, the 52 sets is best, right? Just throwing that out there right now. I'm not saying that from the sources that you're going to be the most familiar with, but I mean, that absolutely was a narrative that did come from some things or whatever. And yes, some people would just post just an infographic of just the results of no context and stuff. And I think that definitely is not helpful in terms of
Yeah.
it. So I,
We came at it with a meme, and even the meme, which was super controversial, was titled "Junk Volume is a Myth?" question mark exclamation mark, portraying people that are talking about junk volume specifically, not that that you need 30 plus sets or 52 sets to maximize growth, or that's like a necessary thing. But there are people out there that feel that they will lose muscle mass if they overdo it. And I see this being quoted sometimes. There's this meta that supposedly shows volume leading to muscle loss. And this is what annoys me. It's like this meta is looks at body composition changes, and there's only one study that directly assessed hypertrophy. So you're talking mostly about DEXA, BIA, and some other measures. And there have been some people out there that are quoting this study that shows that greater volumes led to worse results. And the studies included in that meta were some of them were not even aimed at actually increasing muscle mass or investigating increases in muscle mass. Anyways, all that to say, I didn't get the people losing their shit. I train with maximum 10 to 12 sets per muscle group per week. My quads get 1 set per week from squats. My hamstrings get 10 singles per week from deadlifts. And the upper body gets more love. But yeah, it's bro. Nobody said do 52 sets. Go fuck yourself. Sorry for the PG. I'm getting demonetized here.
no, this is not a PG podcast by any means. Okay. Yeah. So I do think that 100% there is a double standard from a lot of people on research. And I think there's a huge double standard on anything that suits somebody's biases versus that opposes that, right? There'll be people will absolutely tear into every detail of a study that goes against their biases and overlook every limitation of a
Yeah.
study that suits their biases.
I think that the participants were at a true 2 RIR for every set, et cetera, et cetera. Personally, it said approximately 2 RIR, and that was at volitional failure. No. But do I think that we have enough evidence overall to hint at the idea that greater training volumes than this arbitrary sort of cap at 20 sets per muscle group per week can be beneficial for muscle growth? Yeah. Does that mean that benefit is something insane that will cause you to look substantially more jacked? No. Do I think that in certain cases it may make a difference, or at least a perceived difference in specific populations? Blah 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 blah. Maybe. That's the take. It's not such a hot take. And anecdotally as well, it's not such a hot take. Like you see it. Like overall, we're seeing people are making gains with all sorts of shit: low volume, high volume, medium volume, strengthened, all sorts of bullshits, different ranges of motion, mid reps, smid reps. Yeah, like it's fine. Stop losing your shit over that. Like it's okay. It's not that deep. That's it.
Yep. I'm gonna do my own kind of
Oof.
review of that study and the volume stuff, and I'll probably quote some of the other interpretations or whatever. So if you guys want to do a chat on that study specifically afterwards, then you can go ahead
It,
and let
it
me know.
doesn't matter, man. It doesn't matter if we chat about that study, man. Like it doesn't matter. We've chatted about it. We've broken it down. We've
But I
said
haven't
everything
chatted
that
about
us.
it yet.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
But I'm the
We can chat.
authority here, right?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
My,
But it's like they don't seem to listen. They don't seem to get it. Like we are being presented as the 50. They the science people told you 52 cents. Nobody said that. Nobody. Nobody.
Yeah, I don't,
Even
I'm not going to review it in the context of that. It's more so just going to be like my evaluation of the study as a whole and the evidence as a whole, and what are our practical takeaways and what position stand, I guess, is the correct way to put it, giving the totality of evidence, right? Just kind
sure.
of updating that. But I do have, I mean, I think I look at a lot of research from a different perspective that, like, some people look at it and they'll be going through the statistics, right? And other people will go through and they'll be looking at some other metric or whatnot. And I think I look at research and I take in my practical experience and my understanding of the mechanics and stuff like that, and have usually different questions than a lot of the interpretations that I see. Right. So my critiques are not going to be the same as a Lyle McDonald's, what he's coming up with, right? So to speak. But when I was talking about the double standard thing, I know there's a double standard in terms of interpretation, but like some of the things that like I've seen related
Give me
to
some
the
examples.
ego would be like, so like for an example, your leader, Brad Schoenfeld. I have made like almost the exact same comment as Brett Contreras on one of his posts. And Brett Contreras got praised for the idea. And I got told that I needed to be more humble and basically know my place, right? So to speak. And what I take away from that, because I mean, Brad doesn't owe me anything, but I would say on average, I haven't had like positive interactions with him, but it is what it is, right? Not everybody is everybody's cup of tea. But what I take away from some of those interactions, and I've had similar things with other people and also similar reactions to the lab work that we do house is that it's almost like, hey, there's this group of people that is allowed to question things and talk about things. And if you're not in that group, then you are not allowed to speak on these ideas or ask these things or be critical. And I find that funny, especially given the number of interactions that I've had with some of these individuals. And I've made a joke before. All right, what's my record versus PhDs? It's just of a joke. I don't have like I don't have a thing against formal education, but I do think that like when it comes to sometimes in the science communication area is that I think some of the most vocal voices that we have are not necessarily the most astute. And I don't think it helps the credibility when they make very basic mistakes or they hold people to double standards of like, all right, if two people are literally saying the same thing, but one guy's in the cool kids group and the other one isn't, the response to those things should be the same. It shouldn't be like, oh, you're part of our group. So I'm like,
Is
yeah,
it the
that's a
cool
great
kids
idea.
group though? What? Because I can give you other PhDs that will say these PhDs are shitty PhDs, and now there was a video that said, I don't remember exactly by who, but something along the lines of, yeah, a lot of the volume research has come out of the lab, implying our lab, as in Brad's lab, and it's brother. One study has come out of that lab. The rest is from other labs. There's this idea now that I'm not sure that how much of a cool group it is, or whether that's the idea that these double standards are such a big thing exists just in our heads because we're living it up close. But it depends on who you ask. Is my opinion. You can ask some other PhDs and they'll tell you, these people they suck, and vice versa.
Yeah. I'm
I
always
don't
just
know.
looking for whether or not, because regardless of whether or not I feel like somebody's right or wrong, what I try to do is get a sense of the objectivity. Because I mean, I've gotten things wrong. Everybody's
Same, and
likely
we
going to
will all get
get
things
something
wrong.
wrong. But I think the
And
difference between some people is that some people are getting things wrong, but their intention was never to do good. They came up with something, right? I mean, we all know another bald person that basically is not really objective with the way that they're using science or research or whatnot. And it's all just, oh, hey, how can I leverage this to affirm my biases or oftentimes just attack another person and call them a clown or whatever it is, right? And then there's people that
He
are like, yeah,
drives
okay.
he drives a nice car though, so he wins in
Yeah.
my books.
Yeah, I'm Devin. That's all that matters, right? Is to watch you wear the car that you drive, et cetera, right? Or you can be like me and spend all of your money on equipment and lab kit and stuff like that, and then get shunned by the scientific community for trying to play with their toys. So,
Just buy the PhD, bro. It's like
yeah,
I don't know why you're shying away from. Just state you're a PhD.
yeah. Let's just start calling myself doctor. I could do that. Your assumption is that, okay, if somebody has a PhD, you're going to go into that conversation assuming that they have a certain understanding of research, et cetera, and stuff like that. But do you think that, what's your honest opinion on, okay, how many good or bad actors are there that have high academic credentials versus
Mm.
low academic credentials? Do you think that we can use those credentials and it increases the probability that somebody is a good actor and that it's good information? And let's keep this not to the totality, but just to the people that are actually active on these social platforms. Because honestly, I don't think that all of the doctors that are just, they're doing the research and they aren't like, getting involved in, this space, right? I don't think it's worth kind of evaluating that. It's more so it's like the front facing people that the average person is going to come in contact with.
I don't know. I don't know how many. Like I couldn't give you a proper response. How many like I'm not gonna represent the PhDs here, and
Yeah.
like
But
from
you're the
my
real
my
doctor.
we are. I mean, okay, you want a citation for that? I will give you a citation. Okay, paper called "Whom Should We Call a Real Doctor?" published in the which journal is it? The Canadian Medical Association Journal. And
It's Canadian. Nobody cares.
let me just read the conclusion that says, when we are asked in a physician's or a dentist's office what kind of doctor we are, we respond, the real one. We are the ones who teach others. We hope this contribution helps in clearing up the confusion in the community about the title doctor. But joking aside, do I think I cannot name many bad actors would mean, and again, like I'm not supposed to be some all-knowing entity here that is gonna speak for the PhDs because that's another cringe thing I've seen. The PhDs, bro, we're not like we don't gather, don't we? Maybe we do. Maybe we do gather. You
I
never know.
just, yeah,
Um,
I was hoping you were going to give me the location so that I could get my gown and everything for the,
we'll send you the gown. But joking aside, from my own experience, like for somebody to be a bad apple, they must be a net negative in the community, right? Because keep in mind, I, for example, there are people out there that may speak with more speculation or less sort of like real science, the boring science. The more research is needed. All the stuff that people don't like, they want science to be this absolute source of authority that gives them the answer, and it's that answer. We saw that as well with the pandemic. People treated science as okay, they're going to give us the absolute answer, and the media then made it worse. Blah blah blah. And there are people that are not being as scientific as I'd like them as a fellow researcher, and I'm like, okay, now they're just talking mostly out of their ass, and they're making up stuff based on speculation. But you see that with those people, overall, they're a net positive in the community with the overall advice they give, with how encouraging they are with people engaging in resistance training, blah, 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 blah. And in certain contexts, they're being a bit more liberal with how they use science, which I disagree with, but I wouldn't call them a bad apple because their contribution is a net positive. Does that make sense?
yeah. I think it's very hard if we make the standard of somebody's a net negative. It's pretty hard to be a net negative. I could think of a few, but like that leaves most people in the net positive realm, especially like when we put the context of if we are getting people to go from doing nothing to like doing some training, or at least not making the most egregious mistakes in training, then that's a net positive. I think as you move up the echelon, then that's where that can start to change. If I'm if I'm nitpicking and I'm thinking about like the stuff that kind of bugs me the most in terms of, all right, not stuff that's like bad actors, but stuff where I'm like, is this what I would consider science based, or where I think that it's being kind of misused? And I was actually hoping to have Milo on for this, but since I have you, I'll have you talk about this just in general. So, but I want to use like the example of the body, like, oh, here's the optimal or science based exercise for this or whatever, right? So it's okay if I have here's the science, the best bicep exercise based off of science, right? Do you think just hypothetically, do you think that could even exist at this point? Do we have the data to say, oh, here's the best bicep exercise based off of science?
We can make an educated bet.
Okay. But is that a science based bet at that point in time?
Yeah, like it's a bet, but you're making that bet based on prior information, which in this case is scientific information.
Okay.
It's the same. It's the same as what would you know? I mean, I don't need to give it an analogy there. Yeah, it's an educated bet that if we are trying to find the most optimal exercise and we're making a case that can exist based on that, what boxes should that exercise tick? Hypothetically, these boxes. Okay, but again, because what's the worst outcome there is that maybe it's not that much better than another exercise, but we are making an educated bet based on current scientific evidence. Until we
Yeah.
have all those exercises tested one by one, blah blah blah. Yeah, you can't say for sure. But again, it's this sort of content is not fun for everyone, or not everybody wants to engage in that. But it's the same way with the opposite side, like the all you need is five exercise sort of people. Is that all you need? In what context? You can argue there as well, but
So let,
I
let,
accept
let,
it.
let me point out why I think this is an issue in the space and somewhat harmful to the science is the language, right? So take somebody that's got an academic credential and they make a video that says, oh, hey, here's these science-based exercise, right? So with that credential, we assume an understanding of the research
Mhm.
and the science, right? But in reality, it's an opinion on the evidence, but we don't have there isn't if we have the list of check boxes, right? It's still subjective of which of those check boxes are most important. Right. And that could vary. The which ones are most important could actually change a little bit depending on the conditions of the exercise and stuff like that. And certain things it might be like, okay, one exercise has a longer muscle length, but another exercise is actually more challenging there. The whole incline versus preacher curl thing. And then there's specificity, and then there's stability, and then there's all sorts of other things that we can layer on in terms of what is the skill demand and the practicality, et cetera. Right. So if we're labeling optimals as like ideal, not so or removing all limitations, then we can look at it simply from okay, what are the check boxes that we would have that would affect like the physiological outcome? I think that that's not being that's not being done. So if we take, for instance, the bicep curl or the bicep video where it was this seated cable curl thing with the arms like way behind the back, right? And it's okay, this is the best bicep exercise that you need to do, or whatever it is, right?
It is
It is, right? Yeah. Okay. There you go. So
the
that's
end.
the solution,
Next
right?
question, please.
Yes. Science based, right? And I look at that and I'm like, okay, well, we look at the difference in muscle length at shoulder extension in that position. At a certain degree, the length does not change very much. And the orientation of the shoulder actually is going to have a big impact on the long head. And there's an anatomical mistake. I don't think he made it in that video, but like in the review of Paul Carter's video, like saying something
We
like,
don't say that name here.
yeah, the long head of the bicep is the only one that crosses the shoulder. And that's basic anatomy. That's not true. The short head of the bicep crosses the shoulder. It inserts on the coracoid process in the scapula. It crosses the shoulder. And that's why I kind of asked, okay, as somebody that has a degree in sports science, what is the underlying like foundational understanding of anatomy, biomechanics, and physics? Because if we're going to have these check boxes, a lot of those things depend on those foundational sciences. And so if I'm going to be like, hey, this is the best bicep curl, and I'm going to have these check boxes, and I'm going to talk about muscle length. Well, if I don't understand the nuances of anatomy, then do I really know how to set that up for the longest muscle length? And knowing that actually that two heads of the bicep cross the shoulder, there isn't one exercise that stretches both of them maximally. I could choose the exercise that stretches them both to the greatest degree relatively, but not each individual maximally, right? Because the short head's going to actually lengthen more in abduction, and the other's going to be lengthened more in adduction with the shoulder extension tight to the body, et cetera. Right. So I could be like, well, if I want to work both heads, I could do this. But if I want to work one head more, and the principle that I'm going is getting to the longest length, then I could do this, right? And then when it comes to the principles of stability, right? Sitting is not a magical, like sitting does not increase the stability of a lot of exercises to any significant threshold. And in reality, when it comes to that stabilization, like if we're taking the research on force output, if we're doing hypertrophy training, we're not doing a 1 RM, right? We're usually working at force outputs that are lower, and we're pushing closer to failure where those things aren't going to be limitations. So how we look at not only how much stability we need when we're working at a submaximal load and not for strength is different, but also like what actually would stabilize that. In this example, the arm is just being pulled back here. Sitting provides almost no benefit for that exercise relatively. What would actually provide stabilization would be to actually have something that would be on the back of the arm, so that it would eliminate the excessive torque at the shoulder, so that the elbow flexion could be the main thing being challenged there. Without just continuing, you can kind of see the process I'm going through in here is that I think that if we're going to have people with the scientific credentials using science as a brand, and then pointing, like making content that does come off relatively absolute, and they're like, this is the best. Because when I see, oh, this is the best science-based bicep exercise, right? As being somebody that's, oh, I like science, and I think science should be one of the things that we use to inform our decisions, probably to a huge degree. I'm thinking like, okay, this leverages that. But man, my standard for what better come after those claims is really high. It shouldn't have basic anatomy mistakes. It should encompass all of that stuff. And I think having a lot of practical experience is going to help in a lot of those instances. Because when we're talking about designing designing exercises is not as simple as, hey, here's the check boxes we want, and just randomly coming up with a way to solve that equation. Because trust me, there's a ton of ways to go about trying to lengthen a muscle. And some of them result in horrible exercise outcomes, and some of them result in great exercises outcomes. Because some are going to be in a much more orthopedically friendly position. Some are going to be in a position where we can get a length and bias resistance challenge. Some of them are going to be more stable than others. Some of them, the motion is going to allow you to have more specificity than others. There is a certain, you have to have the right combination of these things, and to get what would be a optimal exercise. It's not just like, hey, anything that's long length, cool. That's one part of my critique. And then I'll let you, if you want to respond to that now. Otherwise, what I'll say is that what I think, here are some potential solutions, or we'll say like steps. I share your view of not having a lot of hope that we can kind of get more people to come to the middle. But I don't think that there's a 0% probability. And I wrote a couple of these bullet points
More
down.
people as an absolute number, yeah. As a percentage is where I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm skeptical.
Right.
More people will engage, but it seems like the disclaimers and stuff are going over people's head, and that's strictly dictated by bias and the want for a science based sort of conspiracy to exist, and for this, yeah. Anyways, that's
I think disclaimers are good, but I think it's too late for those to be effective, right? I think kind of once the stigma is there, now having more disclaimers, not only is like that not the interesting part of the pieces of content, right? But the people that have already turned their nose the other way on science-based content or certain content creators, et cetera, aren't going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to go back and listen to this guy now because he puts disclaimers in
but
his
what
content.
really created that stigma? Like, was there the one big fiasco that, because if it was like, yep, they told us this, turns out protein is bad for your heart and now we're dying. Or turns out that training close to failure is actually causing muscle loss. And all this time, I mean, okay, that would make the bodybuilders wrong. But like, where did science go that wrong? If anything, science has helped us sort of simplify things and be sure that, oh, okay, it's not that deep, bro. Just go gym, lift weights, and you're gonna be fine. Like,
Well,
what caused that distrust? What was the camel that broke the camel, the straw that broke the camel's back?
we can think of several examples where something in science has maybe turned the trend in a not good direction. You even spoke about like the squatting is bad for your knees, right? And the knee shouldn't go over the toes, right? Those are both things that kind of came from poorly done science, right? We look
Fine.
at the insulin hypothesis, et cetera. There's still people that are like on that. Oh, all right, it's like all right, just don't eat carbs and that's all that matters, right? But it's the same thing on the opposite extreme of nothing but Sequel matters. And now all of a sudden we're having research on everything from chrononutrition and all of the psychological aspects of like the different macronutrients and, how that affects things in the real world. So I think there's plenty of times where, and I don't want to say this is okay. The science, I mean, sometimes, yes, there was just bad research done, right? In bad conclusions, like in the squats being bad for the knees, like conclusion, right? Like, okay, that was just poorly done. Same thing for the external gastric study saying that you can only absorb 20 grams or 30 grams of protein or whatever the hell it was. And that study was designed using not in vivo digestive system, right? That was as bad. You could even take the anatomy study, the Ackland study that the Voldemort, who shall not be mentioned, constantly references on lat training, and they're trying to go through the external moment arms on the lats and whatnot, and there's no rib cage, right? So it's like, how do we have the external moment arms without the internal anatomical pulley being present, right? And then like, okay, yeah, all right. Sometimes there is just poorly done studies. And then sometimes there's just poor interpretations from that then translate to a certain group of people or sometimes even a movement, an entire movement in the industry towards one thing. So I think that it doesn't mean that that's not me taking an anti-science approach. That's just me being like, hey, science has not been perfect. It has not had 100% at bat record with its conclusions or its consensus. And things have constantly shifted back and forth on things like frequency and volume and failure. Like these are things where the consensus has kind of shifted from one extreme to another, and they're slowly
The poor
coming like more towards
communication,
the
though.
middle.
It's
Right.
not the
Well,
science, it's the poor communication of science and the people
sometimes it's
clickbaiting
both.
it.
Sometimes
Yeah,
it's both.
okay, but
But
there
but
hasn't been that one big thing where you're like,
I
"Oh,
don't think, yeah, there's one thing. And as much as we want to attribute, it's always easy to like want to just blame one single thing rather than the death by 1,000 cuts. Right. But I really think that's kind of what it is. It's been a death by 1,000 cuts. Right now, in the social media era, I think it has been it's almost been entirely the interpretation or the misuse of the word. It's every broccoli haired TikToker making, hey, here's a scientific or the science based back workout, right? And all it is just them pulling one little thing from one other study or something, or likely it's not even them reading the study, it's them copying from somebody else that mentioned the study. And then they're like, okay, now this is the scientific back workout and this is the whatever, right?
yeah, I
And
get that."
And then you have all these people going back and forth. That's not what this says. I think that people wish that science would give them an absolute answer. And the reality is that it's in a lot of these, especially in our field, we don't have the absolute answer on a lot of things, right? We have some general guidelines. We're removing some extremes, right? On the
Mhm.
edges of things, right? Okay, if with rep ranges, cool. We're chipping off at the edges of what's probably not ideal, right? In things like that. So I think that it's what people's expectation of science is too absolute, right? And then there's also the constant usage of science as absolute in a poor context, right? But that being said, I don't know that the solutions are technical in terms of getting people to come back to the middle as much as they are going to be kind of more. I don't know if cultural is the right word, but hear me out. Here's kind of like the ideas that I have, right? One is just being more fair when it comes to assigning credit and blame. For instance, if we take away from the people that were using a methodology before science had affirmed it, right? If we just say, if we don't acknowledge those people simply because other people that were also bros were doing things that were wrong, and we're like, yeah, these people just got lucky. So it doesn't count that that they guessed this right. Right. I think that having more of a kind of acknowledgement of success or people getting it right in the field would go a long way, right? In terms of like, all right, cool. Look at these people. They were applying this stuff early or whatever. This year, some anecdotal support that goes on top of the scientific research, right? And then instead, I think most of what I see is that there's a dismissal of anybody practicing these things before the research. And then, oh yeah, everybody was trying everything and these people just got lucky. But the reality is there's plenty of people in the field that were getting way more than 50% of the stuff right. They were getting lucky far more often because they were actually using a scientific process in their coaching. They were being like, hey, these things seem to work and these things don't. And very few things that are terrible ideas or terrible methodologies are going to survive in the field because there will be enough of a signal of, okay, these things are not yielding results. These things are yielding results, right? So on average, junk will slowly get filtered out, but just not as fast as if we can run a controlled study. So that's one possible way that I think that this could be bridged. And then on the other side, the same thing of acknowledging how much we're able to start to help now in the field because of the scientific foundations that we have, right? Like this being able to guess the starting points and have those probabilities to work with is a huge advantage in the field. And a lot of people just assume that because something is common knowledge, that knowledge is just magically came about. When in reality, it's no, this is a combination of tons of experience in the field and all the research that has been accumulated. And now this has now actually become something that is the consensus is so strong on this that we kind of almost take it for granted, if you will. All right. The other thing I was thinking is that there's like this, how do I say it? Right. I think that if we look at things as discovery, like if I think too often with research that especially certain communicators act like this is discovery process rather than an affirmation process. And I do think that sometimes rubs certain people in the field in the wrong way. And that's why the pushback of the people been doing this forever or whatnot is when I feel like the scientific discoveries we made shouldn't be used to take and put people on a pedestal. By all means, the researchers deserve credit for the work that they're doing. But if they come across as if they were the ones that discovered the methodology, I don't think that's a good look.
Let me pose this though. Like, there's a difference between somebody doing something and doing a multitude of things in the context of resistance training and having a hunch that this may work just because it feels good or whatever. There's a difference between them presenting some form of rationale that is at least logically thought out and uses and draws upon some scientific evidence, even if that's mostly speculative evidence, and presents a case for why it works. There's a difference between a bro back in the day saying, "Oh yeah, yeah, I'm doing partials at short muscle lengths because I'm keeping the blood in the muscle." That's what a lot of people would say in Greece. I'm doing mid-range partials because that allows the blood to stay in the muscle, and that is good for the muscle for some reason. Like, a lot of the stuff that was being proposed by a lot of bros, it was either not properly sort of thought out in terms of why it's effective or why it may be effective. And at the same time, you had a lot of people preaching from the opposite side of the spectrum. So just lumping everyone together and saying, "Oh, they were doing it. They were right." I agree that if somebody was out there for so long, if you were there years ago saying lengthen partials, guys, potential mechanisms, blah blah blah. Here's also some very like preliminary scientific data. There's something to this, and everybody was going like, "Ah, f that guy. Cass doesn't know what he's talking about. He's off his whatever again." Then yeah, and I come out and say, "Yep, I came up with this." I get that. Yeah, you should get your flowers too, especially if you are making an actually like a proper argument for why that may be working. But if
Okay.
you were just saying, "Yeah, I feel like squats are like there may be more to just leg growth from squats because that's how I feel," and then that ends up being the case. Okay, you're not gonna get many flowers because you just essentially chose one thing, made a
Let's
bet, whatever.
let's use that example because I can use it for me specifically, right?
It's
In terms of not specifically for length and partials, but for length and bias training, right? That is something that we have been teaching is, hey, when our goal is hypertrophy, we are going to bias our exercise selection to more length and bias movements, right? And that is something that I have been lecturing on, for years before any of the length and partial studies have come about. Right now, I will admit that like early on, like I did have, okay, here's why I think that works. Like in the original rationale was we thought it was is like it was more muscle damage because of the correlation with the increased soreness and DOMs, et cetera, that were coming along with those
mhm,
positions. And we thought, okay, maybe the mechanism is that, okay, the damage portion of that is somehow giving us a higher adaptive signal to respond with more protein synthesis, et cetera. Right. And that's probably not the mechanism. That's almost surely not the mechanism. But the observation was in practice, applying these techniques seems to be yielding better hypertrophy than applying these other more shortened bias movements. Right. And so that observation was there. The mechanism was not threshed out. Today, we have the research based observation that length and bias training seems to be beneficial for hypertrophy. The
mhm,
mechanism is still not fleshed out,
mhm.
right? It's still not fleshed out.
Yeah, it's multiple potential mechanisms.
There's multiple potential mechanisms, right? And so my theory on the mechanism is different on why.
Yeah, but
And where, where,
that's a big point there though, because if muscle damage was the main mechanism involved, and then overall that mechanism, even back in the day for hypertrophy, was a question mark, and then it sort of became, yeah, muscle damage may not be
Mhm.
that important after all. Then doesn't that sort of take away the flowers that you can like? You'll get like a little rose, but you're not getting the whole bouquet or
Yeah,
whatever it's
well,
called in English.
yeah, I mean, by all means, nobody has figured out the mechanism. Therefore, nobody deserves credit for figuring out the mechanism right now. But that's different because the only thing that we figured out from the research right now, we haven't figured out the mechanism. What we have figured out is that this seems to yield that outcome. And I'm not the first. I'm not the first person to come to that conclusion to see that these things are valuable. Now, some people just found them as like an intensity technique or whatever. People were applying them differently, right? But and I'm just using this case because this is it's a topic that we're both very familiar with, right? And I can use my specific instance here, right? I mean,
Hmm.
but this applies to all sorts of methodologies out there and different things, nutrition, et cetera, otherwise, right? But it's so if if we take the current, like the current recent research, right?
Hmm.
And it's okay, cool. Look, like science discovered that that this is better. Okay, I can look at this and be like, I was observing that here before, and I didn't know what the mechanism back then was. And just like the science has changed, I have a different hypothesis on what the mechanism may be, right? But still, nobody has figured that out. And
Hmm.
I would say the majority of my hypotheses that had like kind of changed over the course, because I had this conversation with Milo when he came here, right? We sat and we talked about it, and I was like, here's why I think this is working, right? Because I like digging through the mechanisms because as somebody in the field, the more I understand about the mechanisms, the more I can understand how to apply and manipulate these variables. Right. So it's okay if I understand that this is more about resistance challenge than absolute length, then I know that I can pull on one of those levers or choose one more the other when I have to choose between the two, right? Or is it okay to sacrifice a small percentage of length for a much more stable exercise? It's a better challenge in that position, right? Again, just to continue using a simple example, the preacher curl over the incline curl, right? Understanding the mechanisms of like why lengthen bias is beneficial would help me understand, like when I'm looking at different exercises, like, all right, one's is a little bit more longer absolute length, but one is a slightly better challenge with not as quite of a long length. How do I evaluate which one is better without actually having a direct steady comparison? So yeah, cool. I'm thinking about the mechanisms is something I do all the time because it's going to change slightly how I'm kind of organizing the check boxes, right? But I don't know. I have to
But you,
basically, I can only use observation at this point. But my main point is that, okay, there are plenty of instances where somebody has came up with a methodology, right? Or had an observation of, okay, this is happening in practice. Not often the mechanisms are kind of what is up in the air, right?
mhm,
And then later, maybe we flesh them out, or in this instance, we still have not fleshed those mechanisms out, right? In addition to the muscle damage, the thing that I coined that up that attributed more damage was simply that there was a higher tension experienced by the muscle in those positions, right? And that may still be a valid mechanism. It's just not the mechanical damage is not part of that. It may be that there's some that coincides with it, but it's not the causation. It's just a correlation thing. But there was still a tension component to it back then, right? And now when I'm looking at this, the mechanism could be as simple as simply that, hey, we're just accomplishing more volume load by eliminating the short position that fatigues first. It could be as simple as, hey, actually it's really just eliminating the short position is just changing the stimulus to fatigue scale that we end to set out, right? Who knows? Right. At this
mhm.
point, there's a lot to flesh out there. But yeah, my
So you
point
want,
is,
but you want your flowers from the scientific community, because like you've been getting flowers, like your business has been growing, you have been growing as an educator, your company has been growing. Like John Meadows, for example, also got his flowers for
yeah,
a lot of us. Like the community has given you and a lot of other people that had called this stuff, they're continuously giving you flowers. Is it more that you want some
I,
of the scientists to go, yeah, yeah, Cass had said that.
yeah. So what I'm using this as an example of where I think that to get people from, just call them the bro community, to pay more credence and listen more to the scientific community, I think that is a way to create that bridge, right? So yeah, you know what? Nobody needs to go back through and look at my work and be like, oh, look, Cass was way ahead or whatever, right? I'm just using this as the example that we have here, right? But I think on scale, seeing that, seeing recognition from the academic community in that creates a bridge between those communities because it's kind of a sign of respects of the field. And I think right now there's basically kind of a mutual disrespect across the fields. And somebody's going to have to extend the first olive branch. So I don't think that you're going to put a dent in this by, I would love to see somebody like you or Milo or anybody else's like in the academic field, instead of being like, here's the scientific community and let's like take a shot at something from the bro community. What I would like to see more of is you guys actually picking apart the bad and poor usage of science. So instead of being like, oh, picking apart this bro concept or whatever, because to be honest, most of the educated people in the bro space are gonna parallel and they already understand like the worst that's in like the really bad ideas or extremes of that. Right. But if
Hmm.
the place where there's probably mutual disdain is the places where science is being weaponized or misused. So if somebody makes, hey, this is the science proven chest workout, right? And you poke that apart and you be like science proven chest workout question mark, and then be like, okay, let's look at this. What is supported and what
Yeah, I get it.
limitations are being overlooked and stuff like that. I think like to me, that is the
We're
step in the
we're trying
direction.
to though.
Yeah. Okay.
We're trying like we like I'll speak for myself, right? Like I'm not gonna, but I've made quite a few posts on misusing science or the abstract warriors or the PubMed warriors and the science-based lifter. I mean, who says the science-based lifter? Yeah, I started lifting 3 months ago. I'm currently preparing my 16-week quadruple undulating periodized rectus femoris specialization training program based on the latest science. Deadlifts are suboptimal, bro. Dead ass for real. We've been trying, and that's why I'm losing hope because I'm like, guys, like we're making fun of those guys too. Like it's not just the bros that have that. I know.
I know.
You can pay me
Um,
though if you want, and I'll just say Cass was always right. Like
all
a
right.
fixed fee every month, Coach Kassem. I'll change my name to N1 Education after the
Yeah.
two surnames.
Yeah. All right.
Is that an actual yeah?
Yeah, we'll look into that, right? We'll see what the ROI on that, how much traffic can
Ah.
you as a paid influencer drive to my business, right? I mean, it's the name of the game today, right? Is just, yeah, right. And just you just pay for somebody's endorsement and that's all you need to establish credibility, right? Whether that's through direct payment, sponsorship,
And
let
when I
you
see people
the
like
limelight.
Joe, like when I see like Joel Seedman being that regarded, or then you see like people like Paul Saladino, or you see other not even questionable. Oh, did he misinterpret the data a bit here about this minor thing? Like you see people being out there and saying, "Celebrate your high cholesterol," like that's verbatim. And that shit flies, and they get traction, and they make money, and they are regarded as trustworthy. That makes me lose hope even more. That it like people will listen in the end, and we can shift that balance.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, that's an area where nobody's pulling that pendulum back to the middle, right? Because you can make the argument of the opposite side of that too. Is okay, yeah, like having the lowest cholesterol probably isn't that healthy, right? And how many terrible documentaries and whatnot have been
Yeah,
made
yeah.
promoting the vegan diet, except, I think in all of these areas, the tendency is to play the game that works best on the platforms, which is to
Mhm.
just take one extreme. And I think like memes, if the only content that you're making that kind of is corrective is the meme stuff, I, I, I think that's probably not going to make the dent. I'm sure that it will be good in terms of engagement, right? But there probably also needs to be some thoughtful breakdown of some of the stuff. So I don't know. I'm going to start doing reaction videos, maybe. I don't know. I haven't decided. You already gave me permission to do the scientific back workout. react to that video. You gave me, you said I had to be at least an hour and whatever.
At
Right?
least some compliments, though. We look big in that video.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I was going to call out how I am probably going to mention how the videographer just totally did you dirty, because the slow-mo shot that he picked of you was one of the warm-up sets where you only have one plate on the machine. And I'm like, really? That's the slow-mo shot?
Oh,
They go like, oh, it's the fucking warm-up set. Right. It's like one of the only shots that actually shows the weight. And it's like,
yeah, that's true.
right. So, oh man, they did him dirty there, right? That should not be the slow-mo shot right there. That should be a quick cut right there. The slow-mo shot should be the one with all
7
of the
plates
plates on there, right? So,
for sure.
um, so we'll see what
Nice.
you think of that, and we'll go through. I think we've spent plenty of time on this today, and we've lost the interest of everybody and blackpilled the entire community on science and
Code.
pros and training. Yeah.
Just always throw a code at the end to see who's listening. Code 501. Comment that on the platform that you're listening to show that you are indeed a real one. And yeah, that's how when you see 2 comments, you're like, yep, it was those 2 guys that listened. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. We've been here for 3 hours now, and it's been quite productive.
I try and get as close to the Joe Rogan experience as I can. And that means that every conversation has to be about 3 hours long, right? And full of misinformation, right? Just kidding.
Yeah.
Anything you want to shout out? Anything exciting that is coming up?
When is this going to be released?
Probably 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Okay. We're coming to the Arnold. So
When
we'll see you all.
is the Arnold is
The
the last week?
First of
February?
third. No, 1st of March to 3rd of 1st of 3rd.
So you come back to the States. So does that mean you're going to make a trip to Colorado?
I was hoping you would make a trip to Columbus.
If I bring you guys here, there will be a much better training experience than trying to train in Columbus during the Arnold. Just
We're not going to be
I've
there.
done that many
We're not
times.
going to be alone though. We're going to be there with a certain special guest that we're bringing.
I see.
We're bringing we're coming with, but again, like this has to be released in 2 weeks, so it's officially announced first.
Yeah.
So
don't
you
have to
can't do
tell
me dirty. Yeah, I'll tell you afterwards.
But no, seriously, if you guys have space at the end or whatnot, it would be good to have you out here, especially since on that technique video, you're like, oh, N1, they specialize in the subtle little fucking changes, right? And I would like to show you a little, I would like to give you
And
a
they
little
will
bit
be
more showing of what we do here. And then we'll get some video of you describing how subtle it was. And it won't even take me 52 cents to show you.
Okay.
Right.
I gave you flowers there as well. I made the disclaimer specifically so nobody can say, Kassem. I said, obviously, I don't know what you do exactly, right? So maybe that's somewhat inaccurate. But at the same time, I did try to say, hey, that's totally fine as well. Because a lot of people will be like, hey, stop overcomplicating it. Just pull the bar down. Look, if there's a different way that you show me to do them and they feel much better, I might start doing stuff differently.
Yeah. I think that's a big misconception people have is, if you don't have, if you like, it's hard to, I look at it like this, try and imagine a color that you've never seen. And
I did.
It's physically impossible to do. You can't do it.
I just
right?
did it though.
Yeah. You just did it. Yeah. Okay. Right. All right. That shows me like real doctors
Maybe
tell real lies.
realize.
But that's how I look at a lot of this stuff is just that most people are so far away from the understanding that they can't even conceptualize the differences that are possible until they experience it in person. And that's why it's such a hard thing to market in the highly online bias space, right? Is a field like biomechanics, right? Because it's not something that you can very easily learn through a textbook or a video. It needs human movement needs to be learned as a human moving, not watching a two-dimensional screen or reading text. So cool. Anything else, or you want to let people know where they can find you, even though we'll put all that stuff down in the below?
It's all there below. I just want to say thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. And we'll definitely see you at some point at Colorado. I'm not sure if it's going to be now because we're going to be pressed for time, but we will see you in person and I'm ready to convert. I'm ready to change quite a few things and enjoy new approaches.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.